Aloha and welcome to Day 2 of the Living Mystery Symposium 2021 Diversity and Consciousness. I am your host, Jeremy Vaney, and if you missed last night's program with Teokas and Ghost Horse and Lahua Lopez, it is streaming like forever. You can find it on Facebook Live, on YouTube, my YouTube channel, and rather than me remembering what those are, why don't I just tell you can go to jaylonproductions.com, Jaylon productions.com. I don't know why I'm spelling it. I likely will have it at the bottom of the screen right now. So jaylonproductions.com if you want to watch last night's program for the first time or revisit it. Today's program is going to be mind-blowing. If you thought last night's was mind-blowing, you're right. And this will be mind-blowing in a different way. We're going to take a winding journey through some areas of consciousness that are lesser explored. Sort of elephants in the room, taboo subjects. I didn't realize that that's kind of what we were dealing with when I put the symposium together, but I guess it's true. It kind of is true. Like, these are the subjects that are either dealt with in scholarly circles that you'll rarely hear about unless you're in those scholarly circles, or if they get dealt with at all in a more sort of mass consumption way, it's through like New Age conferences where there's no quality control, and so you'll have like people saying nonsense about important deep topics, keeping them shallow, having them be about making money or making your life better, self-improvement in some weird way that doesn't work. That's not what we're doing here. No, sir. So let's start off with Dr. Dennis McKenna, who's going to take us into a history of well, us, you know, the evolution of at least how we think about consciousness, and perhaps how it actually is, and where is it that this massive imagination in humans came from, or are we enveloped in it? Or did they like eat a bunch of magic mushrooms and have psychedelic trips and then voila, out came like Neanderthal artists or something? Here's me making up stuff. I don't know that happened. Don't take my word for anything. Just listen to Dennis McKenna. And then we'll be hearing from Jeffrey Kripal after a 10-minute break or so, roughly, between Dennis's speech and Jeff Kripal's speech. And he will be taking the conversation in a different direction about how in the humanities there are certain figures who we've been led to believe had sort of hard-won, well-thought-out positions of wisdom, philosophies, and led us, or at least Western society, in new directions of thinking with this. And what he's discovered long ago, and is now going to give us in the form of Nietzsche. That's Friedrich Nietzsche, which I've always pronounced Nietzsche, so I feel more comfortable saying Nietzsche, but probably he's right. Turns out he, like so many others before him and after him, probably gained his wisdom as a form of visionary mystical insight, not through any sort of like rubbing his chin and pontificating to himself and thinking about these things. And so where, you know, isn't that weird? Isn't that weird that this happens, that it's not from our own personal thought, our own personal self, that this sort of transcendental thought comes in? How is that possible? Why is that possible? And why don't we know about it, if it's true? We'll get to those topics, and then we'll take another little break, and we'll come back, and we will hear from Whitley Strieber, who will talk about his lifelong visitor experiences. People have erroneously called them alien abductions through the years, because that's an easy image to latch onto, and that's one that, frankly, hypnotically retrieved literature that most people have read has catered to. But in reality, it's much deeper and broader than that. And Whitley's going to bring us up to date on where he's been with this and where he's going and where perhaps the phenomenon at large is bringing us. So look forward to all of this. And then tomorrow afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, so that's 1 p.m. Pacific Time. And if you live somewhere else, I don't know what time it is, but we'll be doing a live roundtable chat with all of the speakers from today and yesterday. So get your questions ready. If you're watching on YouTube Live, you'll be able to type in the chat box there, and I'll be able to read your questions. I think you can do that on Facebook Live. If I am wrong, you can always write to me, jeremy@ourundoing.com, and I will do my best to get to every question out there. So write to me your questions, jeremy@ourundoing.com, or just type in the chat as we're going along live, and I'll try to get to your questions. Okay, I think that's everything. Well, one more thing. If you would like to give back, because this is completely free, the speakers have recommended charitable and nonprofit organizations to give to. And you can always see a full description of them at jlunproductions.com. And I will have the links at the end of this entire presentation. So in like 3+ hours. So go to JLun if you want to read them right now. But do consider giving to these organizations. They need your help. And this is free. So if it's in you to give back and you've got the funds to do it, go for it. All right. For now, sit back and relax, and let's hear from Dr. Dennis McKenna on what the heck we are and how did we get this way. Dennis McKenna spent a number of years as a senior lecturer for the Center for Spirituality and Healing, a department within the Academic Health Center at the University of Minnesota. From 2006 to 2008, he was a visiting senior research scientist with the Natural Health Products Research Group at the British Columbia Institute of Technology. He then returned to the University of Minnesota, where he currently lectures. He received his master's degree in botany from the University of Hawaii in 1979, his PhD in botanical sciences from the University of British Columbia in 1984, and continued into postdoctoral research fellowships in the Laboratory of Clinical Pharmacology, National Institute of Mental Health, and in the Department of Neurology, Stanford University School of Medicine. His research has included the pharmacology, botany, and chemistry of ayahuasca and ukuhe. He has also conducted extensive ethnobotanical fieldwork in the Peruvian, Colombian, and Brazilian Amazon. McKenna's research led to the development of natural products for the Avita Corporation, as well as greater awareness of natural products and medicines. He has authored numerous scientific articles and books, including The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss and The Invisible Landscape, which he co-authored with his brother Terence McKenna. Dennis also serves on the advisory board of the American Botanical Council and on the editorial board of Phytomedicine International Journal of Phytotherapy and Phytopharmacology. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the Living Mystery Symposium 2021, Dr. Dennis McKenna. Here we are. All right. Well, Dennis McKenna, welcome to the Living Mystery Symposium, or welcome back. I guess you're our returning champion. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's a pleasure to be there. It's a pleasure to be here, and I wish I was there because I think you're still in Hawaii. And,
yes.
I am definitely not in Hawaii. I'm in my basement office in Abbotsford, British Columbia, and I look back very fondly, remembering that symposium that you organized, which was last time I was in Hawaii, and it was a real treat to be able to come out there and spend the weekend with you, and then hang out with my friends. And it has a warm place in my heart, the memory of that.
Oh,
I don't know if this will make the bar, but I'm sure it will be.
Nothing says warm memories like an online symposium. Yeah.
Right. That's a hard, that's a hard one to top. But anyway, we'll get into it. And I guess what we'll do, as we discussed, I'll show this keynote, and we'll see how that goes, and then we'll follow up with a few questions, and I guess we're done.
All right, let's get to learning.
All right, I haven't exactly I reversed it, but I have rehearsed it, but I've looked at it a couple of times. So let me see what I've got here.
All right, we'll grade you on a curve, so I wouldn't worry about it.
Right, of course. So, so I will start out with this, and yeah, this is a talk I've given in various forms, generally much longer than this one. So this is the short version. I'm tempted to say mercifully short, but anyway, general topic is, since we're talking about consciousness, this is the speculations on the antiquity of human consciousness. So just to frame it, and in order to talk about the antiquity of consciousness, we have to think about what's sometimes called deep time. And I mean really deep time. If you look back at the evolution of the planet, the evolution of life on the planet's about 4.5 billion years old. And life showed up in some very rudimentary form around 4 billion years. And then there was a gradual increase in complexity over the next few billion years. Photosynthesis is something that was a milestone because that marked the point basically at which plants or plant-like organisms emerged into the biosphere and devolved this very neat trick, which I was just writing about, of photosynthesis, the means by which organisms, plants, basically can capture the solar energy from the sun by light harvesting pigments and use it to spin out complex organic molecules, essentially the molecules of life. And that was pretty important because one of the byproducts of photosynthesis, it sequesters carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but it releases oxygen as a byproduct, which is very convenient for us because we happen to breathe oxygen. But when oxygen showed up in the biosphere for the first time, it was a toxin, it was a poison, a corrosive poison. And as a result of that, a lot of the critters that were living free and without much elaborate membrane structure, the non-eukaryotic organisms started migrating, started taking shelter from this toxin, and the eukaryotes, the nucleated organisms, emerged, followed by multicellular life and so on. We didn't begin to show up until, life on Earth was in some ways a pretty boring affair for the first, 4 billion years. It's not till about 500 million years ago that things began to get interesting. Because the land plants, the first land plants and the last land animals emerged, then the dinosaurs, then the mammals, the flowering plants showed up about the same time, and the earliest humans showed up in that very top slice, which is so thin you can't even see it. And that's from about, depending on when you start counting, that's from about 5 million years ago. I don't know if you can see my cursor on this screen, but can you see it when I move it?
Yeah, I see it.
Okay, so about 5 million years ago, is the epochs that we're talking about, the Pliocene followed by the Pleistocene and the Holocene, which is more or less the epoch that we're in now. And, there's this whole spiral of life, incredible, increasing in complexity, but it wasn't, again, mammals appeared, complex mammals, complex nervous systems began to appear around 5 million years ago. And what we might call primates, the precursors to us, hominids, showed up somewhere between around 2 to 2.5 million years. And then there was an increasing, uh, uh, rather rapid advance in complexity. So just to sort of review what those milestones were, phylogenetic milestones in the emergence of consciousness, uh, basic functions like arousal, motility, the ability to respond to environmental stimuli, which is a kind of sentience, really, showed up in the early Cambrian period, around 540 million years ago. And then not much happened for another couple 100 million years. I mean, nature is never in a hurry when it comes to evolution. Usually, although there are exceptions, which we'll talk about, but the divergence of these phylogenetic lines, the ancestors of the major lines of animals on the planet, birds, reptiles, and mammals, began to appear around 315 million years ago. And as that's reflected in brain structure, there were phylogenetically conserved distinct structures like brainstem, encephalic structures such as the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the neocortex, the precursors of those structures in the brain, which of course are highly expressed in the human brain. And along with this came recurrent or feedback processing. These structures are the neural core for primitive consciousness in vertebrates, including humans, of course, many, many millions of years downstream. But basically, the ability of vertebrates to sense the environment and respond to it. And an important milestone in the emergence of consciousness is the consciousness of the self, the so-called mirror self-recognition in primates. And that showed up about 5 million years ago. And this is where, the divergence of monkeys and apes, where they actually can look into a mirror and recognize that it's themselves looking out, and we don't think much about that, but that was actually a major step in the evolution of consciousness, was the ability to recognize the self. And then from anywhere from 4 to 2 million years ago, we got this rather explosive expansion of the neocortex, the newer, evolutionarily newer part of the brain, which reflects, which is ultimately the seat of human consciousness. The cerebral cortex and so on. And that's when we began to see what we might be able to call, really, without reservation, a form of consciousness, a subjective inner experience, the ability to experience dream-like states, the ability to respond, generate and understand symbols, symbolic processing, and understanding of time, ability to reflect, to remember, and even project into the future, to anticipate the future. And anterior to posterior reference frame, in other words, the way the brain organized itself as more or less a forward-looking kind of structure. All of this happened between 4 and 2 million years ago, so far as we know, based on the fossil record. So here's an example of the rapid increase in the size and complexity of the human brain as reflected in the fossil record. And within 2 million years, up to the present, there was essentially a tripling in the size of the human brain. And this is a very short period in evolution. 2 million years is nothing when you consider the evolutionary timescales that we were just discussing. So from about 2 million years, Homo habilis, Australopithecus africanus, here, probably not yet what we would consider a human, not really a hominid yet. The first hominid is probably Homo habilis, and one of his or her relatives, which showed up around 2 million years ago. And then Homo erectus didn't come on the scene until a little less than 1 million years ago, maybe 800,000 years ago. And Homo erectus, in many respects, is a modern human. It had a large brain, it had a complex brain, made tools, probably understood ritual, and had some sort of spiritual sense, indicated by archaeological records. And then Homo sapiens, which we are, Homo sapiens neanderthalensis was the first, showed up, approximately, again, around 500,000 years ago. And it used to be said that Homo sapiens, neurologically modern humans, which had the biggest brains, about 3 times the size of Homo habilis, about 500 cubic centimeters for Homo habilis, and about 1,500 for Homo sapiens. So Homo sapiens are modern humans, neurologically modern humans. And conventional wisdom used to be that modern humans, Homo sapiens, did not show up for about 100,000 years ago. But that keeps getting pushed further and further back. So we now pretty much believe, based on what evidence there is, that Homo sapiens showed up around 350 million years, or 350,000 years ago. There were modern humans, and modern humans, like us, like them, presumably, are characterized by the ability to essentially create an internal map of the external world, what I sometimes call the reality hallucination. And it's like a schematic. It takes sensory neural input from the outside world through its sensory receptors, and it processes that into what is essentially a model of reality. It's not reality itself. Reality itself is unknowable because everything we perceive is through these sensory neural filters. So it takes that data, it combines it with interpretive functions, with association functions, inner experiences, memories, dreams, random pieces of information, and it constructs a model reality. It constructs a hallucination that we then proceed to inhabit. We live within this model reality, which is a good reflection, we assume, of external reality. We assume it's a good reflection because I have to stop doing that. Because it enables us to navigate through the world. So, and our outputs into the world, which is the means by which we affect the external world, emerges out of this hallucination, this model or schematic of reality that we can generate and then inhabit. And there are many discussions, many speculations about what consciousness is, but I like the definition that consciousness is this. It is this ability to create a world of abstractions, to understand symbols, and to visualize internally symbols and abstractions, and then associate those with meaning. That, to my mind, characterizes real consciousness rather than proto-consciousness, which some of these other things do. The fully functioning, conscious, subjectively conscious modern human, and presumably, modern Homo sapiens back in the day, is based on this ability to generate this abstraction. And so, like it or not, there may be other definitions of consciousness, but I think that one works for these purposes. Want to talk about the impact of certain technologies on the evolution of consciousness, primarily fire, controlled use of fire, and along with that, cooking technology. And again, looking at the archaeological record, we have evidence that the controlled use of fire goes back around 1.7 million years ago, probably earlier than that. But we don't have evidence of it. But in this cave in China, dated to 1.7 million years, there's evidence of heat discolored mammalian bones, a place where they were splitting bones and taking out the marrow and so on. And then it goes, from there to relatively recent times, 72,000 years ago to 164,000 years. We see evidence of continued use of fire and complexification that's associated with that in terms of the tools and so on that were produced. So fire and cooking, two very important inventions or discoveries, however you want to characterize them, were, I think, very important in the evolution of human consciousness. This controlled use of fire enabled us to invent cooking, and that changed enormously daily life in terms of nutritional resources through hunting and that sort of thing. It extended the range of human activities into the dark, because you could make candles and torches and that kind of thing. It provided warmth and protection against predators. It vastly expanded the nutritional choices available to early hominids, which resulted in omnivory, which was a huge thing because it enabled the diet to be enormously expanded into the consumption of plants that normally would be avoided, because they couldn't be processed through cooking. It was great protection against parasites, and cooking meat reduced the amount of energy needed to digest it. It may have enabled a transition from arboreal to savanna habitats, which also was an important transition. And it enabled game to be hunted using fire. So that introduced much more protein into the diet, which was important for these expanding brains. It allowed a more efficient utilization of complex carbohydrates, enhancing the absorption of food energy. And it also enabled things like fire-hardened spear points to be produced, and a fire-enabled pitch from trees to be softened to affix those points to spears. So that was another major technological advance, that fire enabled. Well, what about the fire and cooking and the emergence of consciousness? Well, many of these technologies, it didn't happen without planting inventiveness and skills. The use of fire in hunting, for example, required coordination among members of the tribe to corner these animals and use grass fires to drive them into ravines where they could then be conveniently harvested after they'd stampeded into ravines. That doesn't happen without a certain amount of social cohesion and inventiveness. So whoever was doing this and using fire in a controlled way were certainly conscious in some way. And this use of fire enabled the transition from an arboreal to a savanna habitat. And that could have made a difference because in the savannas, these hominids were hunting these ungulate species, these cattle-like or antelope-like species. And undoubtedly, in this environment, they would have encountered the psilocybe mushrooms, which are symbionts on these ungulates. They grow on the dung of cattle-like animals. Also, cooking technology placed into hominids' capabilities, the essential tools, essentially, of chemistry and pharmacology. Simply the ability to make concentrated plant extracts, which really didn't come into its own probably for several 100,000 years after this, but at least the basic capability was there. So in this savanna environment, these mushrooms probably were there, almost certainly were there, because if we look at similar ecosystems today in the tropics, where there are cattle and rainy season, there are pastures, you're going to find these species. They're not uncommon. They're actually pantropically distributed all around the world in the rainy tropics. And because these hominids were hungry and curious, they would certainly have noticed these. You can't not notice them. These are very robust mushrooms. And so they would have noticed them and consumed them, and that might have led to some triggering of the beginnings of consciousness, or the beginnings of the imagination. My thesis is that the internal states created by these mushrooms essentially taught us how to imagine, how to internalize visual data and link it meaningfully to symbols. So the question becomes, how old is consciousness? This ability to create this artificial model or schematic of reality. It's characterized by the integration of inner phenomenal experiences with perceptual and material interactions with perceived external reality. This is the reality hallucination that we generate and that we all inhabit. When did this ability first emerge? Well, we don't know exactly, but it's reasonable to suppose that as long as 2 million years ago, this is when we know the ability to use fire began to emerge in the human species and gave us control over the environment, such as hominids had never experienced before. So it led to the migration into these savanna habitats. It led to the invention of these more efficient hunting tools. Cooking enabled omnivory, leading to better nutrition, more animal protein, leaving less time to digest, needing less time to digest, and more time available for ruminating. And then also rudimentary chemistry and pharmacology. So fire was a huge game changer in that respect. And the beings that developed these technologies were conscious beings by any measure. They were able to think, plan, visualize, and express their inner abstract ideas in the external physical world. All of this within 2 million years or so. And this led to the emergence of hominids. Humans are an anomaly in the order of nature. We're the only species with the complex language. We're the only technology utilizing species. We're the only species able to store information outside of ourselves and transmit it non-genetically to future generations. Of course, eventually that came through writing and other forms of external symbols, but oral traditions existed much before that. And that too is a way to transmit cultural heritage, wisdom, learning down through generations. So we're the only species of all the species on the planet for whom symbols, we live in a world of ideas and abstractions, this reality hallucination that's as real as the physical world. And this preoccupation with abstract symbols is the foundation of human culture. Culture is an edifice comprised of art and science, religion, magic, myth, medicine, technology, folklore, law, and so forth. All of this sets us apart from other biological species. And it's also clear that much of human culture, especially language, could not exist were it not for our extraordinarily complex brain. And this is where the effects of psilocybin become important, because we know now, especially from recent work in neuroscience, that psilocybin increases the connectivity of the connections in the human brain. It can actually rewire the brain to make it more complex. And that, combined with the mechanism of epigenetics, provides a mechanism where this increased complexity can be transmitted from generation to generation without invoking the usual mechanism of transmission involving the gametes. This is another way that's non-genetic to transmit genes expressed over time. Some of the oldest artifacts, this is where it gets a little muddy. There's, the evidence of consciousness, we have to look at what we bring into the external world. And, that's what reflects back on consciousness. And the earliest artifacts are these different arrow points, like the Oldowan hand axes. These are reliably dated at around 2 million years. Other things are much more recent. The javelin points in Ethiopia, only about 280,000 years old. Believe it or not, pottery is a fairly recent invention. There are ceramic shards indicative of making pottery only about 20,000 years ago. So, the timeline for the development of these inventions is not a smooth timeline. And a big part of it is there are great gaps in the record, in both the fossil and the archaeological record. Here is another example of something interesting. This is a 500,000-year-old engraved mollusk shell. And this was not made by Homo sapiens. This was made by Homo erectus. And in fact, it was found at the site of Java Man in East Java, the first Homo erectus excavation ever done. And this shell was kept in a museum for many years, about 100 years ago, and then recently re-examined. When they looked at it, they could see that it had clearly been carved. It had been engraved in a deliberate way. And the guy that made that discovery said it was a eureka moment. I could see immediately that they were man-made engravings. There was no other explanation, said team member Dr. Stephen Monroe. This is the first time we have found evidence for Homo erectus, a hominid species ancestral to modern humans, dating from approximately 1.89 million years ago to 143,000 years ago, behaving this way. It rewrites human history. So if we want to speculate about the antiquity of consciousness, this is maybe in a certain sense the place to start, because this is one of the oldest artifacts found that clearly indicate an artistic sense or an ability to have an abstract idea that you then manifest in the external world by making these carvings, these engravings. Here are some other very interesting artifacts. This one here is particularly puzzling. The Makapanskat pebble. This is from the Makapanskat cave in South Africa, and it's dated to 3 million years. It is not man-made. It is not an artifact, but its resemblance to a face. It was found in a cave thought to have been inhabited by a group of Australopithecines, some distance away from the closest possible source of the mineral. Its resemblance to a human face, however, may have been noted by whoever transported it to the cave. So it's what archaeologists call a manuport. It's not something that was made, but it was something that was interesting enough to whoever found it that they bothered to bring it back to the cave. So that again is an indication that whatever person noticed this, that was a conscious recognition that this looked like a human face. There are also these interesting figurines which date around 500, 300 to 500,000 years ago. This object from Morocco may be a natural object, or it may have been modified to look more like a human figure. We don't know. There are remnants of red ochre on this surface, indicating that it was manipulated in some way. And this one here, another ambiguous Venus figure found in the Golem Heights, measured to about 230,000 years ago. So it's incised with these grooves that make it appear more human-like. Whether it was carved or modified, it's not, it's a matter of debate. And then we have to jump forward about 160,000 years to encounter further unambiguous of human artistic sense. This coming from the Blombos cave in South Africa, dated to 70 to 80,000 years ago. There are these ochre plaques, these blocks that are engraved with abstract designs and shells that have been carved with holes and obviously used to make necklaces. So between 70,000 and about 2,000 years before the present, there was an explosion of artistic direct expression in all parts of the world to which humans had migrated. Of course, those that most people know about, and these are certainly remarkable, are the cave paintings, which are found in literally all parts of the world. But in terms of their age, although these are incredibly old, not as old as some of these other artifacts that we're finding. So about the oldest that we find are 45,000 years ago at the La Ferrici cave in France. But these paintings are quite remarkable because they speak to us across the ages. We can appreciate the artistic skill and knowledge that went into the creation of these paintings. Even though the people that made these were much more ancient than ours, we understand them. We understand what was projected, what was intended in these paintings to project. So these are indications of fully conscious beings, even though very old, compared to us, certainly. So that those artifacts that we reviewed kind of put some kind of a marker on this, although you're always speculating. And it's interesting because the fire technology conquered the darkness. It enabled people to spend time in caves. They didn't have to go to sleep when the sun went down, and yet there's no sign. Most of these paintings were done in deep caves where it's very dark most of the time, and obviously they have ritual significance. But there's no indication of any kind of cave painting around the 2 to 1 million a year mark. They may exist, they may not have made it, that's a long time, but it's not clear that hominids were making paintings like this at that time. But certainly from less than 100,000 years ago was sort of the golden age of the production of these cave art. And then finally we come to the modern era, or the almost modern era, around 5,000, 2,000 years to 2000 AD, and that's really the emergence of the mystery religions, like the mystery religion at Eleusis, the Dionysian mystery religions, and ultimately these were the precursors of Christianity. And Brian Marara Eskew's recent book, The Immortality Key, delves into this in great detail. So these mystery religions existed in the Mediterranean before Christianity appeared, and eventually Christianity supplanted these religions and stamped out these practices. But it seems that they may also have adopted some of the sacraments that were used at Eleusis. It's been speculated that it was a variety of some kind of ergotized beer. This picture here would indicate maybe it was a mushroom. Many people have, this certainly looks like a mushroom to me. Many people have said, no, it's not a mushroom, it's a flower. It's kind of hard for me to get a flower out of it, but I suppose that in this kind of depiction, you see what you want to see. So, but this was, whatever they were taking at these rites, it was a psychoactive beverage of some kind. And it may have included ergot, it may have included things like nightshades, it may have included mushrooms. I don't think there was a standard formulation. But by the time these mystery religions appeared on the European scene, and there were a number of them scattered around the Mediterranean at that point, various traditions, and consciousness was fully elaborated, fully evolved. So somewhere between, well, the origins of these mystery religions goes back much further than the Eleusinian mysteries. It actually goes back to Göbekli Tepe, which is the excavation in Anatolia that's been dated to 13,000 years. And there's evidence there that they had a brewing technology. There are vessels that they made, which beer was probably mixed and fermented in. And so that's just on the cusp between what amounts to prehistory and the beginning of history. If we had to put a marker down, when did we make the transition from what you might call prehistorical into the earliest historical era? 13,000 years is about the right point, and it also happens to coincide, if you believe the work of Graham Hancock, which I do, with this major cometary impact that took place over North America around that time, that wiped out whatever existed on the planet at that time of these sort of proto civilizations, and that's a whole area that we will not get into today. But that is that's the end of my rap, and we can talk about it.
Well, thank you for that.
Okay.
God, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
Well, obviously the other thing that Graham Hancock has taken to talking about in recent years, maybe the last decade or so, is the possibility that our creativity came from things like magic mushrooms or ayahuasca, that sort of sparked the imagination of us. How do you believe that?
As a matter of fact, I do believe it. Not ayahuasca. I think ayahuasca is fairly recent in terms of the history of these things. Ayahuasca is a very complex, highly sophisticated pharmaceutical preparation when you think about it. Ayahuasca works, it depends on the interaction of two plants, the addition of a plant containing DMT with a plant containing an MAO inhibitor, and it's just difficult. It's complex. Mushrooms, however, don't require any kind of sophisticated technology like that. With mushrooms, no preparation is required. And I think, you may be familiar with my brother's book, Food of the Gods, in which he speculated that we co-evolved with mushrooms. And that's basically, I agree with that. And I think there's more evidence for it now than there was when he wrote the book in 1990s. For one thing, we know that the hominids evolved in northern Africa, around two and a half, the hominid lineages showed up in northern Africa about 2 to 2.5 million years ago. And we know from paleoclimatology that northern Africa at that time was wet. It was a tropical region. It's a desert now, but there are frequent rainfalls, seasonal or otherwise. So there was rainfall. We know from other archaeological evidence that there were cattle-like creatures there, cattle-like grazing animals and hominid skeletons. All of this has been found there. So the hominids were hunting the cattle. They had controlled use of fire, probably, by this time. And the third part of this symbiosis is the mushrooms. And it's a reasonable inference to think that if the cattle were there, if it was a wet environment, if the hominids were there, then the mushrooms were there, because the dung of the cattle, these aurochs cattle, the ancestors of the modern humpbacked zebu cattle, is the preferred substrate for the growth of the psilocybin Psilocybe cubensis mushrooms. So it's a reasonable inference that the mushrooms were in this environment. And through the mechanisms, as I mentioned before, of epigenetics and the ability of mushrooms of psilocybin specifically, to increase neural connectivity in the brain, and then epigenetics provides the evolutionary mechanism to enable that enhanced gene expression to be transmitted from generation to generation. There you have it. You have the mechanism. And I think, when Terence came out with the Food of the Gods, it was dismissed by most people. And two of the pieces of information that I think make it go from a plausible idea, even if a wild, crazy idea, but not so crazy, but plausible idea, to a more than likely idea, is these two factors: epigenetics, and what we didn't know about at that time when the book was published in 1990. Nobody was talking about epigenetics, and then this increase in neural connectivity. So those two factors, I think, move the needle from plausible maybe to probably. At least that's my position. Incidentally, we're going to be doing a virtual symposium on this in this summer about the stone date theory, because Food of the Gods, Terence's book, is being reprinted. So the publisher we're working with the publisher to organize a one-day virtual symposium about this with some pretty interesting speakers. Yeah. I think Michael Pollan will be on, and some other high-profile luminaries in the field, Paul Stamets, Michael Winkelmann, other people. So stay tuned for that.
Okay. Well, let me circle back to something, which is us coming up from apes. Is there room in science for the indigenous cultures who say, that's great for you, you may have come up from apes, but we came from the stars? Is it possible to have multiple theories of origin be equally compatible like that, or no?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, creation myths are not science, usually. I mean, creation myths are not science. Creation myths are myths, I think they're valid within the culture, but it. I mean, if you believe in evidence, if you believe that science is a way of evaluating evidence, it's very hard to make the case. You can't make the case that hominids came from the stars. I mean, where's the evidence for that? By the way, you can't make the case that mushrooms came from the stars either, even though that's a appealing idea, which Terence talks about. Mushrooms are not extraterrestrial visitors from the stars. They are very well. We understand very well the phylogeny of mushrooms, and we understand the phylogeny of hominids. These are terrestrial species. Mushrooms were around. They appeared in the evolutionary timeline around 75 million years ago. So they were around long before there was anything like a primate, let alone a big brain primate like humans. And there's good evidence that these mushrooms use psilocybin. They had psilocybin, undoubtedly, certain species. It wasn't for primates that psilocybin was evolved. It was evolved probably to mediate their relationships with insects. And there's plenty of evidence for that they were either a repellent or a possibly an attractant for insects. But insects interact with all kinds of mushrooms and play roles in spore dispersal and this kind of thing. So I don't think that these origin myths are necessarily based in fact. In fact, I don't think they're based in fact. I think that these are cultural stories that these cultures invent for themselves. You find the ideas all over the world. These similar, and they're similar, but yet they're different. It's very hard to find any facts about that would tend to support these origin myths.
Well, I guess to me, there's a gray area, which is the translogical. So if there's something that transcends and includes logic that we just can't get from this point of view, then it will look either silly or it will look illogical or whatever. We won't be able to compute it. But people with a different mind who see the world through relativity, see the world through interconnecting nature, and on and on, they may get it in a way that we can't. They may see something that we can't. Do you think that's possible? And let me ask it from with this lens of, like, when you do mushrooms or ayahuasca or any of the hallucinogenic stuff, the psychoactive stuff, where you're brought to is not logic, and I think people report that feels more real than this. So what does that tell us about the limits of logic, at least in terms of how we actually legitimately feel about it when we experience the broader ecology of mind, if I can put it that way?
Well, yeah, I mean, sometimes it feels more real than real. I'm sure that delusions of schizophrenics feel more real than reality to them. So it comes down to this question. We've cast off from science at that point. We've cast off into an area of pure speculation. And pure speculation is fine. Pure speculation is fun, but it's not the way you want to approach trying to verify what was going on. The strength of science is that it can build hypotheses about a phenomenon, a process, some situation, and then if it works the way it's supposed to, you can test the hypothesis. But sometimes it's not. You don't have enough data. For example, my hypothesis that that hominids evolved in this northern African ecosystem in which cattle and and hominids existed. Mushrooms were probably there, and they were probably eating them. I mean, that's a completely reasonable hypothesis, knowing what we know about the circumstances. How do you test it? I mean, the missing piece, the thing that would clinch it, is evidence of mushrooms, because we've got evidence of cattle, evidence of hominids, but those things last, skeletons last millions of years if they're properly, they can be recovered. Mushroom soft bodies don't last 2 million years, so that's the missing piece. But when when a culture has a myth about that they came from the Milky Way, and or they came from the anaconda. I mean, all myths are true in a certain sense. They're true for the culture, but are they objectively true? I don't think so. But then maybe, I don't think so, because I tend to believe that maybe I'm just too much of a hard-bound reductionist, but I think we have to be careful about sort of throwing out the one method that we have to test our assumptions, to test essentially our assumptions about the way things are against reality, and that's what science can do. It is, and that's what makes it a very powerful way of understanding. Now, it's maybe not the only way. I wouldn't say it's the only way, but it's the only way that you can examine aspects of reality and ask questions that give you answers back that you can verify, more or less. And it's always provisional activity, because next week you may have a hypothesis that seems to explain everything, some model, and seems to be working based on the data available. Next week you may find new data that doesn't fit the hypothesis. So then you either have to throw it out completely and start over, or modify it in some way. Say, how do we change this hypothetical understanding so it accommodates the new data? And I could be wrong, but I don't think you get that in these mythologies. The mythologies are stories that are valid for the cultures, but I don't think that that's the way it happened.
Okay. Is there any theory as to why we developed symbolic processing abilities?
Oh, I think, because I think mushrooms stimulate these linguistic abilities. Part of the talk I left out was mushrooms and other psychedelics, but mushrooms are particularly good about this, at stimulating synesthesia, at stimulating the ability to, see sounds, essentially, and hear colors, that kind of thing. The translation of one sensory modality into another one is synesthesia. And language does this. This is exactly what language is. It's a form of synesthesia, where we have an internal, where words stimulate internal visualization and abstractions. We can visualize something in the imagination that corresponds to something outside, or we can visualize an abstraction and we can project that into the outside world. We can say, "Oh, I have a great, idea for making a spear point. Call it the hand axe spear point version 2.0. I can visualize this technological artifact in my imagination, and I can create it. I mean, I couldn't. I could make a hand axe if my life depended on it, but it was easy for these people, and it's all based on this association of internal abstractions with with language and with the external world. So that's this reflection of internal states and external states. We live in a world where abstractions, symbols, and ideas are just as real as anything physical in the world. In fact, even more so. And if you look around right now, artifacts, civilization, everything that we make is basically a reflection of projection of some internal set of concepts and ideas into the so-called physical world. So
yeah, and with that also meaning has meaning.
Meaning, exactly. It's meaning.
So
that is
where
at
does
the
meaning
core.
fit into science then? Well, I'll ask it that way. Just where does meaning fit into science?
Where does meaning fit into science?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't make much sense to me that either we purely evolved up by necessity, sort of the Darwinian, you kind of need this to survive this, and on you go building, or that we stumbled into mushrooms, which just sort of accidentally, happily triggered a bunch of stuff. But the thing that's like really important to us, and as you're saying, like we sort of build it into everything, is some sense of meaning, which is purely or an interior experience that we're projecting out onto the world. So what in survival would be important for us to do that? That we would have evolved that way if it were, as mechanistic as science makes it sound?
I think that it's a difficult question, but I think meaning is linked to a supposition that there's something beyond us. That there's some kind of transcendent thing that we're associated with or connected to that goes beyond the self. And I think that mushrooms were, they could have been cognitive triggers to to create meaning, essentially to stimulate meaning by stimulating these associations between things perceived internally or externally and linking them to portentousness. This is another quality that psychedelics have is portentousness. Which is essentially the attribution of meaning to something. You could look at in a deep psychedelic state. You could look at a flower, for example, and get totally into it and realize, and you get into the state where you tell yourself that is the most fantastic, most beautiful, most incredible thing I've ever experienced. And so I think that people have an inherent yearning for meaning. Otherwise, and that yearning for meaning, I think that gives, it literally gives meaning to life. If and it makes us aware maybe of our mortality, and it makes us aware of what we might lose on death. I don't think animals, other than humans, think much about death, because they don't project into the future. We live much of our life anticipating the future, and we can look forward to the moment of our death. I think that may be another attribute of consciousness, was when it emerged that we can think of ourselves as beings in a space-time matrix, that there was a past that we remember and a future that we speculate about, that we anticipate. And living in that environment, I think that's where the meaning comes from, is the idea that there's something beyond us, and there's I don't know what you would call it. There's I think there's a sense of our mortality, and a sense, that we develop, in a sense that we don't want, we want to survive. and maybe that's the key connection, is thinking if there's something beyond us that's more important, more meaningful than, our miserable lives, then we have a reason to live, and that's got to be evolutionarily useful, because the longer we can stick around, the more influence we have on our local community, our culture, not to mention the opportunities to transmit our genes. Although, after a certain age, that doesn't become so important. But I think that's it. I think meaning is what builds, social coherence in part, and a sense that we're involved in some kind of an existence that goes beyond what appears to be right in front of us, and that's what I think. I mean, it's a tough
tangential
question.
to that. Yeah, well, tangential to that, and you can help me with something here, because I've watched a bunch of, this is sort of on topic, but topic adjacent, which
Okay.
is that I've watched a bunch of YouTube videos now of these, there are all these sort of Terrence and Dennis McKenna, guru wannabe types now that you have brought forth into the world. And they do YouTube videos, and they talk, every single one of them talks about some great wisdom that they've acquired from whatever trip they did,
Hmm.
some great rising or higher consciousness thing. But then they never, to a person, they never go on to say what that is. Like there's never any, oh, and this is what that communication was. They told me blank. Or if they do have a story like that, it's always something that, much like a dream, is important to you personally,
Right.
but isn't really interesting to the rest of the world. Am I wrong
Right.
about that? Or is there anything where we've gotten something really interesting for everyone that applies to the world out of these experiences?
Uh, no. I mean, if someone could make a discovery that again could be scientifically verified, for example, that there really is an afterlife, for example, if you had a way to prove that scientifically, I think that would make a lot of people sit up and take note. I mean, that would be meaningful for almost everyone. I have to say, uh, about me personally, and Terrence also to a certain extent, guru is the last thing I am. I mean, I
Right.
don't want people to think of me as a guru. And a guru is like somebody who, you know, thinks they have it all figured out and is happy to tell other people they have it all figured out. I'm like the anti-guru, you know. Honestly, Jeremy, I don't know what the fuck is going on, and I suspect that nobody does. And I suspect that if somebody tells you that they know what's going on, that they do have it figured out, my first impulse is to run the other direction, because this person is dishonest with themselves and dishonest with everybody else. They're unable to admit that, in fact, we don't know what's going on. We don't know why we're here. We don't know if there's even a reason that we're here. Is this just an accident of evolution and we just happen to be here? Or is there some wider thing? Or, is it a simulation? And if it is a simulation, who are the simulators? And, there are a lot of issues, and I think, one of the things I've learned from psychedelics, I think, people say, you've been doing this for 40, 50 years. What have you learned? What I've learned is how little I know, and that's what psychedelics in the deeper states remind me of all the time. Remember that you don't know shit, basically. You do not really understand the nature of reality, nor does anyone else. I mean, even science, and this is one of the limitations of science, and one of the problems that science has is the inability to recognize and acknowledge its limitations. Science is very good at dissecting uh, very small segments of reality. It's very good at looking at phenomena in a very detailed way. It's not so good at tying all this together into some kind of holistic understanding of what reality is. And I guess that's the task. That's the challenge for science. Science may not be up to it, but I am not a guru at all. I'm not even I guess my chief virtue is that I recognize how little I know, and this is something that science needs to learn too. Recognize its limitations, because there's a tendency for scientists to be arrogant, and there's no place for arrogance, because there's vastly more that we don't know than we do know. So there's plenty of learning left to be done, but we shouldn't assume that we have it all figured out. Not by a long shot.
This, I guess when I said guru, I really should have said like pioneer, for North America anyway. But this circles me back. I had some prepared questions, which I rarely do, and I'll just ask this one because it gets to it. By the way, if anyone hears a snoring cat or a cackling witch, that's like there's a bird out the window that cackles like a witch, and I've got a snoring cat in the room. So just apologies up front if anyone hears this. But
that's all right.
What I wanted to ask you was when you came back from your first psychedelic trips and decided to communicate them publicly to an audience that was used to linear thinking, was there anything either in the substance, the messages or your experiences, or even just about the nonlinear nature of them that you could not communicate back then? And has that changed now? So essentially, you have these nonlinear experiences. It's probably really hard to talk about back then. Was it? And has that changed?
It depends on who you're talking to. It's always been easier to talk to people who have shared the experience, who have had these experiences. This has always been the conundrum when you're talking to people about drugs, and particularly about psychedelics. I mean, if they haven't had the experience, it's very easy to dismiss it. And it's sort of well, this can't be, I don't want to hear about it, my mind is made up, don't confuse me with facts, And so in the dialogue about drugs, we always end up talking past each other. As I sometimes say, if you haven't had a psychedelic experience, at least one, then you're not qualified to discuss this problem, this issue, because you're coming from a place of complete ignorance. When I was first taking psychedelic, I found that I could talk to people who had psychedelic experiences. That was easy enough. People who had never had psychedelic experiences, they just don't believe it. And so after a while, I stopped bothering to try to explain what it was. And I was just basically, you don't have to have faith in this. You just have to have courage enough to try it. And when you try it, sit down at the DMT pipe or whatever you do, take the mushrooms, it will explain so much more about what it is about, and we don't have to keep having this conversation. Well, in the last 40 or 50 years, many, many more people have taken psychedelics, so now they're part of our culture. And a lot of people, even if they haven't taken them, they sort of have an idea what they're about because they've heard other people talk about it. But it's difficult. It's difficult to really explain to somebody the essence of the psychedelic experience if you've never had one. I mean, you've had them, right? You know how difficult it is to explain this. I mean, you say, well, they're sort of like dreams, but not really. They're sort of like fantasies or dissociated thinking, and there are all of these elements. But a psychedelic experience is almost by definition not describable. That's not describable in any language that we have adequately. I mean, we could talk about it endlessly and never really get to the nub of what we're talking about. No substitute
I've
for
also,
experience here.
well, I've been looking up, do blind people see, do deaf people hear during trips? And it seems as though no, unless, if they were born impaired, then that's what they'll experience with. So I don't know how up on this you are or not, but I couldn't seem to find anywhere, for instance, if you're blind and you have a DMT trip or something, you do DMT, you can't see, you don't have the visual stuff going on, but do you have the feeling of the immensity of the experience that somebody who is seeing this stuff has? Do you know
Well,
about that?
I don't know. I think that's not necessarily true, Jeremy. I think it's what kind of blindness you have. I have read reports of people who are blind who do have visual experiences on
Who were
DMT.
born blind?
I'd have to look back into the literature to be sure, but yes, I think so. You
Huh,
know,
okay.
uh, because it depends on where the damage is. Like if the damage is to the eye and the optic nerve and all that, then you can't see. But the hallucinations happen in the visual cortex at the back of the brain. And if your visual cortex is undamaged and functional, you should be able to see hallucinations. But this is a fascinating area to look into, and I do think I remember there are reports of people who have been blind from birth who have had DMT and have visual experiences. But don't quote me on that. I'll have to go back and check. Uh, and hearing, again, same thing. I don't know. There's less. I've heard less about that, but it's I just don't know.
Well, I don't know how much time you have, but let me ask you at least one more question,
Sure.
please, which is now scientifically, you could probably say one thing, but through your actual experiences, would you say that the substances, the mushrooms in this case, are interacting with you, or is it purely that they're activating something in you? I mean, is there an other consciousness there that
Mm-hmm.
really is happy to see you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is the conundrum, isn't it? It's so hard to tell. Uh, the reductionist view is sort of that there is not another entity there, that it uncovers some part of yourself that presents to you as though it weren't the self, and that's what you're encountering, some part of yourself that you never see in other circumstances, but that you experience as a part of yourself with which you can engage in a conversation, in a dialogue, or in an exchange. Uh, and then the other point of view is no, these things really do carry some kind of intelligence. And but then is that true? I mean, psilocybin, pure psilocybin, is a molecule, and it can produce as profound an experience as mushrooms. So you don't have to have the organism to have this other present. Is the molecule conscious? I don't know. Maybe so. I mean, I sort of believe that consciousness is built into reality. That it's probably a fundamental property of reality at the most fundamental level of organizations. So maybe it's possible that molecules are conscious. I mean, indigenous people, they live in a world of animism, and everything is conscious: rocks, trees, weather, water. I mean, it's all conscious in some extent because they don't have these filters that we've erected for ourselves, because we're literate, Western. We're immersed in literacy in Western civilization, which requires that you put blinders on, for a lot of things. This is in a way, this is the power of psychedelics. This is both the peril and the power. They deconstruct this default mode network that we construct for ourselves, or the reality hallucination in another way. They temporarily disable that, and they bring the background forward in many ways, so that you notice things about reality that you're normally programmed to put into the background because they're not relevant to your immediate survival. You got to be focused on, that saber-toothed tiger that's coming after you, not what the carpenter ants on the clearing are doing. But occasionally, it's good to lower those filters, those neural filters, and then you understand things about the environment that were always there. There were always aspects of it, but you're programmed to filter them out. So when you disable those filters, I think psychedelics are actually quite useful for this. You can think of them as a scientific instrument in some ways. You can examine phenomena in the real world, in nature, through the lens of the psychedelic state, and you will notice processes, you'll notice things going on that you didn't notice before, in an unstoned, unpsychedelicized state. You notice them. So then, are they still there when you come back, 48 hours later when you go back? And often it's very much that, yes, they are real. They are really there. I just didn't notice before. So I think psychedelics expands our awareness, and I think that an indigenous person who lives immersed in nature all the time and is not bound by literacy. Literacy is a great thing. We all like to be literate. But in order to be literate, you have to put blinders on. You have to have actually a point of view, and create this fundamental separation between you and what you're perceiving, which is not you, which is outside. I think indigenous people don't really have that boundary. That's why they're immersed in nature, and processes going in nature they perceive as part of themselves in some way. I don't know. I think children are this way too, before they get, at a certain age, before they become closed off. This is part of, the sacrifice you make when you construct this artificial reality that we inhabit. I mean, it's very convenient to have that. It lets us navigate through the world, but it's flattened. It's not as rich as reality itself.
Well, maybe that is maybe that's the place to leave it. So thank you for doing this, and get ready for an onslaught of questions on Sunday.
Okay. All right.
All right, folks, we're going to take a quick 10-minute break. You can stretch and make a sandwich or whatever it is you want to do. And we'll be back here with Jeff Kripal in about 10 minutes. Thanks. Ah, there you are. Welcome back from break. I hope everything came out okay. I hope you had a nice ham sandwich or tofurkey sandwich or a big old plate of cookies. I don't know what people eat anymore. What do I know? I'm just some dude on a camera. And I'm done babbling to myself. Hey everyone, welcome back. You with me still? Wasn't that amazing? I, for one, will be interested to hear what the dialogue will be between Dennis McKenna and Tiokasin Ghost Horse, or Lahua Lopez, tomorrow as regards our potential origins. I just think it'll be a fascinating conversation. And another fascinating conversation will be what you're about to hear now from Jeffrey Kripal, who's going to give his presentation, and then, as with Dennis, I will butt in toward the end and have what I hope is a fascinating mini conversation with him. Okay, let's get into the superhumanities and the super people who come out of them, or go into them, or comprise them. Definitely one of those three, with Jeff Kripal. Jeff is the Associate Dean of the Faculty and Graduate Programs in the School of the Humanities and the J. Newton Razor Chair in Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University. He's the author of 8 books, most of which deal explicitly with what he calls our emerging mythologies, or super story, around the history of science, the philosophy of mind, paranormal experiences, and our shared ethical, political, and ecological challenges. Also, he thinks he may be Spider-Man. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the Living Mystery Symposium, Jeffrey J. Kripal. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am thrilled to be here with Jeff Kripal, a hero of mine, and then it turns out a student of mine. No, I don't know. I don't want to put words into his mouth, but he did write that on my book.
You just did. And you put it on your book, by the way, too.
So, I guess let's just launch into it. I cannot wait to hear what you have to say, and then fascinatingly, it ties in with sort of the way that we left the conversation with Lahua Lopez and Tiokasin Ghost Horse on Friday. And I think people will see that. It was completely unplanned, but it really could have just been a branching off of how we ended our discussion there. So let's hear your spiel, Jeff, and then we'll get into it.
Okay, so let me just say a few words to introduce it, Jeremy, to kind of set it up. I mean, so I've given this lecture a couple times, actually, at Syracuse University a couple months ago, and then at the Parapsychological Association a couple weeks ago. And so it has a kind of parapsychological ring to it that you'll hear. It's pretty nerdy. I mean, it's me it's me being a professor and living in the academic world and trying to argue for a different world, a different metaphysical world that's not the familiar Western one, or not the familiar scientific or religious one. I think something that actually is much closer to an indigenous worldview, but also I think resonates quite well with a lot of Asian systems. So I'm going to give a formal lecture, and then you and I can talk. It's my experience that if I give something formal, there's more food on the table, as it were, and then we can sit around the table and chat. I'm not afraid of chatting. I'm not afraid of talking. It's just I think there is something to be said for putting substance on the table.
Sounds good.
So, okay, is that good?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so the lecture is called The Superhumanities. One word, The Superhumanities. Well, actually, that's 2 words. Superhumanities, 1 word. And it begins with an epigraph from the unpublished notebooks of Friedrich Nietzsche from the period when he was writing Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So from about 1881 to 1884, somewhere in there. And he jotted this in his notebooks. I live so that I know. I want to know so that superhumans may live. We experiment for them. Okay, so that's the beginning. Now this is the lecture. So we might think of the sciences as disciplined forms of knowledge concerned with the behavior of material or objective reality, with the number or mathematics as the privileged symbolic medium. On the other hand, or on the other side of the brain, we might think of the humanities as disciplined forms of knowledge concerned with the expressions of mental reality, or forms of consciousness coded in culture, with the text or narrative or story as the privileged symbolic medium. So object and subject, number and narrative, cosmos and consciousness. Once we understand our present order of knowledge in this doubled way, it becomes immediately obvious why parapsychology has had such a difficult time fitting into that order of knowledge. It occupies by necessity both the material and mental dimensions of human experience. And its most prized phenomena, in fact, collapse this distinction, sometimes entirely. My present coinage of the superhumanities is another attempt to encourage and develop this uncanny collapse, to propose a humanistic science or a scientific humanism. For the sake of the present lecture, however, allow me to focus on something more basic, that is, on how the superhumanities might emerge from the humanities side of things. To put things too simply, but perhaps instructively, by the superhumanities, I mean something that already exists. I mean to point to a fantastic but forgotten dimension of the humanities, which consists of the catalytic presence of altered states of mind and energy that have driven the creativity of some of our most revered authors, artists, and activists. Think Immanuel Kant, the great German idealist, whose private letters express shock and awe at the clairvoyance of Emanuel Swedenborg, whom he chose to mock and make fun of in public print. Think Hegel's interest in Hermetic spirituality and his own contemporary mesmerism and magnetism, by which I mean human or animal magnetism, as they called it. Think Arthur Schopenhauer's empirical experiences of precognitive dream, or William James's well-known psychical researches and personal experiments with nitrous oxide, diethyl ether, and peyote to access other states of consciousness. Think W.E.B. Du Bois's invocation of occult tropes and themes from double consciousness to the fourth dimension in order to theorize race and class in American society. Or closer to our present, think about Jacques Derrida's late conversion to telepathy as the ultimate deconstruction of the human subject. Or think about Michel Foucault's LSD trip in Death Valley, during which he was said to have seen the truth, capital T. Or think Gloria Anzaldua's elaborate descriptions of her own possession states, out-of-body remote viewing, and experience of what she called the superhuman, to theorize borders, mixed races, her own lesbian sexuality, and what we today call post-colonial theory. The list is long and breathless, and I could go on for my full 30 or 40 minutes here just dropping names and describing apparently outrageous ideas, which these people took perfectly seriously. But I will not. I want to say something simpler and then something more complex with respect to a single figure within these superhuman histories. On the simple side, I want to say that the superhumanities are nothing more and nothing less than the humanities themselves, now acknowledged and celebrated as astonishing. The superhumanities are the Superman to the Clark Kent of the humanities, the weird crashed alien to the dull, bespectacled human in the office. Same guy, different costume. There is a less mythical way to say the same. I do not believe for one second that some of the most impactful, really world-changing ideas of the humanities emerged from thinking, much less cognitive, logical, or linear thought. I think they emerged from altered states of knowledge and energy that they were experienced as given. They crash landed. We do not think, we are thought. A corollary follows. To the extent that we reduce or restrict the humanities to these strictly conscious and intentional, rational, or cognitive modes, we will make them culturally irrelevant, intellectually boring, and spiritually insignificant. Such a positing of the humanities as already the superhumanities is a development of the thesis of others, including that of Josephson Storm, that the human sciences, and the sciences, by the way, have always been enchanted, and that the constant claim that modernity is somehow mythless, that it arose by a rejection of animism, magic, myth, and the paranormal, is simply false. The claim of absence is itself a myth, the purest myth of all in some sense, the myth that there is no myth. Such a constantly touted but deeply mistaken claim goes back to the German sociologist Max Weber and his famous argument and accompanying phrase, Die Entzauberung der Welt, literally the demagicking of the world, usually translated as the disenchantment of the world. It never happened, not in any complete or accomplished sense anyway. Often, indeed, if we really look at history in a single room, we can find what Josephson Storm has called both seance and science. And so his book begins in Paris in 1907 with Madame Curie, the double Nobel Prize winner in physics and chemistry, who discovered radiation, and her husband Pierre, attending a seance with the Italian super medium Eusapia Palladino. Eusapia was a kind of occult nuclear reactor in her own right. The attendants at the seance witnessed up close and personal luminous points around Palladino's head, and what they called a glowing luminescence that the medium ran through Madame Curie's own hair. Pierre was blunt about the effect on him. He writes, "In my opinion, there is here a whole domain of completely new facts and physical states of space about which we have had no conception." Unquote. Marie was similarly forthcoming. I quote, "Personally, I am quite willing to accept the existence of unusual powers in mediums such as Eusapia." In Josephson Storm's opening volley, Madame Curie, quote, "was conjuring ghosts or studying paranormal manifestations as part of her physics research," unquote. So were a long line of founding humanist, social scientific, and scientific authors with respect to their own researches. And so Josephson Storm shows us how the human sciences, as they're called in Europe often, in German, Geisteswissenschaften, emerged as academic disciplines in the 19th century alongside flourishing theosophical and spiritualist movements, and shared the latter's fascination with magical knowledge and the spirits of the dead, unquote. In short, there is what he calls an occult side of the human sciences that has been forgotten or actively suppressed. That is precisely what I intend by the phrase, the superhumanities. Okay, first section is called The Most Spiritual Nietzsche. Now allow me to say something a bit more complex, this time with respect to a single iconic figure within this superhuman history. The basic idea of the superhumanities orbits around a specific German seer, the inimitable Friedrich Nietzsche. Enter also the enigmatic future human, or Übermensch, traditionally from 1905, translated as the Superman in American English, but more recently and accurately rendered as the superhumans, in the plural. Such a collective being or superspecies was seen and prophesied by the ecstatic German philosopher in his final years, but particularly in what he thought of as his masterwork, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which came out in 1884. The book would be ignored in the author's time, and by his own assessment, profoundly misheard, or rather not heard at all. Still, it would eventually become one of the best-selling and most read philosophical works of all time. Let that sink in. This publishing tidbit is no tangential factoid. It is an uncanny sign of our modern world, and particularly of that branch of higher education known, but not really known, as the humanities, where the text is commonly read and widely revered, and just as commonly dismissed or condemned to this day. Nietzsche certainly knew he would not be understood. In one of the more humorous but instructive images of his unpublished notebooks, he would write that he is strolling around above our heads on the next floor up. We cannot stand this, so we put what he called wood and earth and refuse between him and us, so as to muffle the speech of his steps. As for the roof over his head, it, quote, begins in that place where all stairways end, entirely beyond thought and experience itself, the open sky. Accordingly, one can hardly claim to have moved beyond Nietzsche, before one has tried to understand him on his own terms and floor, and seriously considered whether he may have well been right and oneself mistaken, or better, whether he may just be talking on different floors. Toward this end, I am presently reading as much of the Nietzschean corpus as I can, including the Nachlass or notebooks. I have not found what I assumed I would find. I have not found an angry atheist or a nay-saying nihilist, much less a postmodern deconstructionist. I have found a godless, mystical writer who described himself as, quote, the most spiritual, unquote, of human beings, and who openly described his deconstructive no-saying books like A Genealogy of Morals and Beyond Good and Evil, as mere Ongelhaken, mere fishhooks, means to catch the reader for the vastly more important yes-saying books of Thus Spoke Zarathustra and its twin teachings of eternal recurrence and the Superman. Indeed, when all is said and done, Nietzsche wished, quote, to be only a yes-sayer, unquote. The genealogies and deconstructions, it turns out, were just warm-up. What I found in actually reading Nietzsche was that academics generally ignore or really reverse Nietzsche's own authorial intentions and ecstatic voice, and focus instead on our own depressing and nearsighted nihilisms and deconstructions. We refuse to look too far. We turn away from the seer's superhumanism and turn back to our own humanism. In Nietzschean terms, we choose to remain kleiner or puny. You think I am kidding? Allow me to quote for you just a few of Nietzsche's ecstatic claims to divinity, a word, by the way, he used all the time. Allow me to begin with his well-known claim on the 6th of January, 1889, in a letter to Jakob Burckhardt that, quote, Jeder Name in der Geschichte ich bin. That is, I am all names in history. Taking the same claim further and sounding downright New Age, he even wrote Wagner's widow around the same time to tell her that, quote, among the Indians I was Buddha, and in Greece I was Dionysius, Alexander and Caesar are my incarnations, unquote. I know such lines are commonly dismissed by philosophers or read metaphorically or as signs of an approaching madness. He would collapse later that month, by the way. Earlier American and British commentators described the final books where such lines are both foreshadowed and developed in great detail as, quote, the blasphemies of a mad atheist, unquote, and as, quote, the most insane portions of his work, unquote. Of course they did. But I take such lines very seriously, indeed as perfectly plausible, which is not to say literally. I do so because I recognize them. In the end, I am most interested in what Jennifer Rotner Rosenhagen, alluding back to a very late letter of the philosopher, calls the post-Rubicon Nietzsche. The seer had indeed crossed over. The claim to be all names in history is a perfectly fine descriptor of a most radical idealism shining through the endless masks of ego and society. I do not read Nietzsche's ecstatic speech then as signs of impending madness, although that very neurological condition, I suspect, helped reveal or release them. I read such deified claims as perfectly accurate descriptions of a much greater form of consciousness that was bursting through the writer's deteriorating body and brain. I read them empirically and imaginally as perfectly honest descriptions of what he actually knew and that was so. Indeed, in the same comparative light, such famous Nietzschean one-liners read rather humbly and not at all surprisingly. We can easily find other genres of ecstatic speech in comparative mystical literature, like the Muslim mystic al-Bistami, who died in 874, who famously proclaimed, "Glory be to me, how great is my glory." Or Bistami's successor in ecstatic speech, al-Hallaj, who is said to have uttered phrases like, "I am the truth," capital T again, and was crucified upside down for such outrageous offenses to Islamic orthodoxy. Tired of deified men? Consider the Christian mystic Catherine of Genoa, who died in 1510, who once described her own most profound realization this way, and I quote, "The proper center of every one is God himself. My me is God, nor do I recognize any other me except my God himself." This, of course, makes both Catherine and God all names in history. Exactly. So what do we do with Nietzsche's famous atheism and his rejection of religion? Well, we understand them. What disgusted him most about religion is not its bold or extravagant claims, his were more so, but what he called its solemn toy trumpeters and its dreary doctrines and lies. It was also all of that disgusting kneeling, the embodied groveling before an imaginary God made up by priests and rulers who wanted to control other people. He writes in his notebooks, "Your knees worship, but your heart knows nothing of it," unquote. Prayer, too, he saw as a kind of whimpering. Such are what he called the habits of slaves. It is all just so small, so puny, he would say with the utmost contempt. This is why it was so treasonous when someone strives for true greatness beyond what he called the herd of religion. But most of all, for Nietzsche, religion is looking the wrong way. It is looking backwards to the past, not forward to the future. It is time to move on. I quote, "The time is past for human beings to nail themselves to the cross," unquote, or to be hung there by what he called some ghastly God who would call this love. The paradox of this denial of the religious past that is also a most radical affirmation of the spiritual future is captured in fragments like these. And I quote again, I am Zarathustra, the godless. Who speaks here? Who is more godless than I am? Then I want to become his disciple, unquote. Or again, I want apostles, but not quiet corners and communities. People of faith, he observed, do not hate free thinkers the most, but rather new thinkers that have a new faith, unquote. Indeed, for Nietzsche, the free thinker is, quote, the most religious person that now exists, unquote. In him, God killed God. Not exactly your typical atheist, more like the ultimate teacher of being spiritual, but not religious. It should not surprise us. All of these astonishing ecstatic speech claims were a result of a revelation Nietzsche received in the summer of 1881. That is, his altered texts were expressions of his altered states. To be more precise, Nietzsche's realization of the eternal recurrence of the same, which he claims to be uniquely given to him as a historical first and to be what he called the most scientific of facts, came to the philosopher in August of 1881, just outside of Sils Maria, Switzerland. It happened near a large alpine boulder on the shores of Silvaplana Lake, 6,000 feet above man and time, as he confessed the most significant moment of his life on a sheet of paper just after the event. The scribbled notation is interesting, as it encodes both the Superman, 6,000 feet above man, and the eternal recurrence of the same, 6,000 feet above time. It implicitly links the two teachings. Put a bit differently, it expresses a vision of both the future human and the superficiality of history as we normally think of the latter. And of course, the double image relies entirely on a symbolism of up, or super, Uber in the German. You could still go and look at the rock up there. Hasn't moved. Seems appropriate. Same rock. The next 8 years would see a storm of writing to the day he fell into psychic oblivion on January 4th, 1889, in a plaza in Turin, Italy. For the astonished writer, these were 8 years of awe, trying to write out a secret that he himself believed would change the course of human history. Indeed, that would help evolve humanity itself. Contrary to what many assume, Nietzsche claimed an actual encounter with the empirical, circular nature of time and the furthest reaches of human being. He was making a claim on the real out of the altered states of his own body and mind, and he was encoding those altered states in his altered texts. This is precisely why so many readers have found themselves in a state of awe or near enlightenment reading these same books. Such readers are genuinely grokking that elevation of consciousness secreted in the Nietzschean texts. They too are being lifted up to the floor above us, where Nietzsche laughs. Part 2, Nietzsche the Precog and Paranormal Prodigy. Nietzsche was also a precog. Let me be historical here. Nietzsche did not have the word paranormal. As far as we can tell at the moment, it was coined in 1903 by a French scientist and lawyer named Joseph Maxwell, no doubt after the earlier English word supernormal of Frederick Myers. Both terms attempted the same intellectual work. They attempted to naturalize the supernatural and locate it squarely within, not outside of, the natural order. Paranormal or paranormal means to the side of the normal. It was meant to signal what is normal but not yet understood or recognized by our present sciences. Such a sensibility is perfectly Nietzschean. As the writer put a similar idea in his notebooks, we do not believe in many things only because we do not believe in the conventional way they are explained. That is the generous sensibility that Maxwell was trying to get at with a word like paranormal. Nietzsche certainly did not make this mistake of not believing what he could not explain. Contrary to the received images of the writer, Nietzsche was extremely gifted in just these worlds and words, and he wrote about his own anomalous experiences extensively in both the published books and the unpublished notebooks. Words like uncanny, eerie, omen, clairvoyant, sixth sense, premonition, eternal, divinatory, strange, divine, prophet, saint, mystic, soul, even miraculous, demon, and God occur often and in ecstatically positive ways. To cite a single example, there are hundreds. Consider this one. Now I am clairvoyant. My diamond sword cuts every darkness to pieces. For too long, I was obsessed with clairvoyance. Along the same lines, it's important to recall here, Nietzsche accepted what he called spiritistic phenomena as quite real, but read them as unconscious communication, often unconscious even to the medium, and as we have seen, as functions of a palpable electrical current passing from the medium into the participants of the seance, often with very real physical effects. Think Madame Curie and Eusapia Palladino again. The paranormal details go on and just get weirder and weirder. What are we to do, for example, with Nietzsche's claim to smell souls? That is, to possess what he called a perfectly uncanny sensitivity, so that the proximity, or what am I saying? The inmost parts, the entrails of every soul are physiological perceived by me, smelled, unquote. This, he claims, acts as a kind of, and I quote, psychological antennae with which I feel and get a hold of every secret, the abundant hidden dirt at the bottom of many a character enters my consciousness almost at the first contact, unquote. True enough, we could entertain ourselves with the easy notion that the philosopher was just being poetic or rhetorical with such lines, that he was somehow writing about picking up subtle physical cues, writing about what we call intuition. We could easily enough reduce the man to our own banality, read him through our own secular, postmodern prejudices. We could say that this something that sets this man apart was his overweening confidence, his arrogance, which he himself noted, by the way, and called divine. Or perhaps we could attribute it all to his impending neurological collapse that made him say all those outrageous things, none of which, of course, are really true, none of which he really believed. We could lower him to ourselves. Or if we wanted to be more neutral and nicer, we could point to the writer's absolute conviction in the future centrality of his ideas in person and confidently say that he just got lucky. That every other professional writer, of course, thinks something like this, and a very few of them turn out to be right. Nietzsche was just happened to be one of them. Still, none of these rational responses really get at what is at work within, or perhaps better, above these uncanny texts. What Nietzsche often described as the lightning bolts of his words hurled into unknown futures. Certainly, superficial words like arrogance and madness seem much too tame and frankly lame. I mean, can we really call such lines like, "Why I am a destiny," or Nietzsche's constant refrain that his books and ideas were of world historical importance, simple arrogance, much less symptoms of some ordinary madness? Most of all, what professional reader of Nietzsche really acknowledges the historical fact that, well, he was right? Nietzsche did in fact predict, and with great accuracy, the future effects and global influence of his own writings in person. And this despite the other fact that his books were basically utter flops in his own life. If we did not know better, we might think the man actually saw the future that he was writing about. Maybe he did. Parts of it anyway. Nietzsche often reveled in the fact that he was among those, quote, premature births of an as yet unproven future, unquote. That he belonged to what he called an as yet undiscovered country whose boundaries nobody has surveyed yet, unquote. Still, at least some valleys and hills of this undiscovered country have been enthusiastically surveyed since Nietzsche wrote these lines in 1888. Again, we call such uber phenomena paranormal or parapsychological and try to catch their various impossible expressions under abstract Greek letters like psi, or, for the truly literate, super psi. Such, of course, are academically difficult expressions, intellectually damned words, rejected pseudo-expressions today that fit into no established order of knowledge. So much the better, I say. Take precognitive phenomena. Nietzsche knew such things personally and wrote about them as a simple fact of his life. In 1851, for example, as a 13-year-old boy, he dreamed of his recently deceased father emerging from a grave, going into a church and returning into the grave mound with a child in his arms. I quote, "On the day that followed this night, little Joseph, his younger brother, suddenly fell ill, seized by severe cramps, and after a few hours he died. Our grief knew no bounds. My dream had been fulfilled completely." Unquote. Such a moment is impossible, of course, within our conventional understandings of time. It cannot happen. Or if it does manage to happen, as it did here, it can be nothing but an intuition, what Nietzsche would call a puny word, or perhaps a coincidence, punier still, a statistical blip in the heartless random order of meaningless dead things, puniest of all. Although you hardly would know it from most of the humanist and scientific discourses of this much abused topic, we of course know a great deal about precognition from over 2 centuries of impressive medical, scientific, philosophical, and popular literatures. Not to mention historical studies of Nietzsche's beloved ancient Greece, where divination was central and is accepted as an integral part of civic and personal life, and was widely accepted by major intellectuals, including Plato, Aristotle, Iamblichus, and the Stoics. From these varied literatures, we know that sensing the future is a universal phenomenon, clearly present and widely reported in all human cultures for which we have sufficient record. Perhaps this is why sensing the future is also the focus of one of the oldest and most varied forms of ritual practice on the planet, divination. We also know that such future seeings are seldom perfect, much less reliable. Seers, diviners, and precogs get some things very right and get other things very wrong. Freud, a clear inheritor of Nietzsche, taught us that a related superphenomena, telepathy, or what he called thought transference, commonly works in unconscious, overdetermined, symbolic, and associative ways, like a dream. We know from contemporary writers like the anthropologist Eric Wargo that precognition works through very similar psychoanalytic processes of unconscious translation and internal censorship, often as a dream, reaching back from the near future, exactly as we saw above with little Friedrich's dream. Or in the waking day, now as an adult, in this obviously precognitive line from his last book, Ecce Homo. Nietzsche writes, "I once sensed the proximity of a herd of cows, even before I saw it, merely because milder and more philanthropic thoughts came back to me. They had warmth." Unquote. That's something that precognition names happens all the time, usually unbidden, especially to gifted writers and people in danger, distress, or death, or falling into madness. Something just opens them up to a greater spatial and temporal reality. They become antennae of reality as it really is, not as we think it is in our local languages and adaptive but grossly limited brain-based cognitions, perceptions, and grammars. The topic of precognition, in other words, is no tangential matter. It has everything to do with the isness or nature of time itself, which just happens to be the subject of Nietzsche's final teaching of eternal recurrence. Final thoughts, and I'm almost done here. These are called not so super. I should finally add that I am not claiming such extraordinary experiences for myself. Nietzsche strolls above my head, too. But I am claiming that the history of human civilizations sparks and spikes with exactly these kinds of impossible superhuman states. That indeed those global and local histories make no sense at all without them. I am also claiming that many of the canonical figures of the humanities had or were these states as well. Finally, I am also claiming that to the extent that we do not have, or perhaps more practically cannot imagine such impossible experiences, we cannot and will not understand these founding figures or what they have gifted us. We will underestimate vastly the humanities, because we will not see that they are also the superhumanities, and as such involve both the mental and material dimensions of our cosmic existence. That's my point. That's what I'm trying to say here. Finally, let me say this. As an aging man who usually does not feel very super, there's an understatement. I am quite certain that I am wrong about any number of things. I don't care. We don't have time for being right about everything. The important thing is to get the ideas out there. My colleagues, students, friends, and readers can then agree or disagree with these ideas, reject them, correct them, nuance them, or develop them further. They are the future superhumans to whom I look forward, for whom I experiment, and for whom I want to know. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you, sir. The first obvious question that comes to mind is when you give a speech like that to colleagues, especially those who are scholars of Nietzsche, what do they say? Are they receptive to it?
Yeah, well, so I haven't had much experience with Nietzsche scholars. I certainly know Nietzsche scholars, and I've shared some of this work with at least one of them, and he was very receptive to it. I get that question usually in a different form, Jeremy. The question really comes down to, how do you get away with this? Or how do you deal with all the pushback? And I have to say there really isn't much pushback. My experience with people in my world, at least, is that most everyone is deeply sympathetic, but they're in the closet. You know, the culture keeps them shoved in the closet, but they already think these thoughts. They know these things happen. They're just not really sure how to talk about them. And we're not really sure how to change the public culture. But I don't really have to convince most of these people that this stuff is real and it's important. They're already there.
Well, when you say change the public culture, do you mean change them? Because the public would change if the scholars took a different approach.
I don't
know. We're taking our cues from the stodgy old scholars as to what to harumph, right?
I don't know. Are you? I'm not so sure. I mean, does the culture listen to intellectuals? I'm not so sure it does. I mean, on some sense, yes. There's a kind of way that elite intellectual culture leads a culture. But that's the irony here, is that the humanities have always been the superhumanities, but it's constantly erased or ignored or denied. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. I I can't work in the medical field or the legal field or the entertainment industry. I'm not in those worlds. I just happen to be in this world, Jeremy. It's just a professional zone I happen to make a living in. So I want to affect change here where I'm at. I can't affect change where I'm not at.
So let me ask you this, because the answer is usually to why things are the way they are in terms of how we think about these things, is that there is this fear of ridicule and all of that, and it sounds like it goes back to rational reductionism in our culture and so on and so forth. But as at least, well, I mean, as far back as Egypt, we can see that Egyptians talked about a first time that was not logical, except in mythological terms. And so we tend to take everything after that first time and say that's history, and everything prior to that has nothing to do with reality. And then Peter Kingsley, who is, I guess you would describe as a scholar and a mystic, discovers that the grandfather of logic and rationality in ancient Greece, Parmenides, actually was, talking about, yes, logic and rationality, but as coming from sort of the mystical visions or whispers with a nameless goddess, who essentially ends up being a goddess of the underworld. So ignore that part, go with the rational, logical, argumentative part. Same thing with Carl Jung. Carl Jung comes up with, a brand of psychology, which actually stems from his visionary journeys that we don't find out about, at least in the public, till decades after his death. And, the Red Book, which is his book of those journeys, reads like an occult Bible in some sense. Yeah. And so how do you... so it's not enough to say this comes from post-modernity or modernity, about our uptight, logical, materialistic. It goes at least as far back as Greece, maybe as far back as how we look at Egypt. What do you think it is in westernized societies that does this, that just sort of, I don't know, edits and then has amnesia, right up front, and then years later we look back and we go, oh, wait a minute, yeah, no, this had translogical underpinnings. Any clue why we do this?
Well, so Jeremy, I don't think it's anybody's fault. I mean, I'm not here to blame someone. There's no committee sitting around deciding these things, right? I think it's somehow a function of the phenomena themselves. These anomalous phenomena are not obvious, and they need to be focused on and interpreted to take on meaning, and they can often be doubted or rejected. And so the skepticism around them is reasonable. I mean, it's understandable, and it goes back as far as we can see. I mean, I think Peter Kingsley would say that Greek thought made a wrong turn at least with Aristotle. He'd probably say with Plato, but to the extent that it rejected these Parmenidean and Pythagorean mystical realizations and turned into something that was kind of more reasonable, as it were, or naturalistic, it was already going down this path, 2,400 years ago. So I don't blame the last few decades or even the last few centuries. It's just a constant pattern in at least Western thought that we're more and more uncomfortable with this side of who we are, and we repress it, and we do it in very subtle ways, but also institutional ways that have to do with money and technology and the refrigerator in your kitchen and the iPhone in my bag. I mean, all of these things are in some sense a function of ignoring all this stuff and focusing only on the material aspects of reality. So it might have a purpose. I mean, it allows us to make cool stuff, but it also has devastating, I think, spiritual effects that we're struggling with.
the way this ties in with Friday night's event with Tioxin and Lahua is like one of the last questions, or maybe even the last question I asked them was, talking about Ancient Aliens, the TV show Ancient Aliens. And is it possible that instead of aliens coming here and building big monolithic structures, or even, the notion that this is takes a lot of time and a lot of technology, is it possible that however ancient peoples built this stuff, or indigenous peoples build, actually comes from an inherent knowing, like sort of knowledge in the way that we see and we claim is instinct in insects and animals and all of that, where there's this coordinated, logical bunch of things that they can just do out of the ether. If we're interconnecting that way with Earth, does something like that come through all at once that looks like it would take technology, looks like it would take a lot of time, but really the know-how just comes in an instant? And in a way, that's what you're talking about here, except philosophically, right? Like, I mean, that's what we're saying here, is that somehow, some way, we call them mystical encounters or whatever it is, that a rational doings somehow, like vast rational, just come to us all at once, and they're not out of the personal ponderings, they're out of the silence, out of the ether. Do you think that, well, I guess one just sort of, I wonder how far we can take that. Can we take that does it happen holistically? Does it happen in other ways for us? And then is it scary because we have built up this sense of the objective? And the objective is us me personally looking at something as outside of myself and judging it and bouncing it off of my prior knowledge and all of that. And here's something that cuts right through that with a completed, set of actions or complete set of logical ways of thinking. Do you think something like that is just, for some reason, scary to us? And if so, scarier for scholars who have been trying to break away from superstition, from religion, from any sense of, that, the bigger?
Yeah, I think this is potentially apocalyptic, or in the spiritual sense, not in the physical sense. I mean, I think where this stuff goes is that there is no ultimate distinction between mind and matter. And once you start denying that distinction, you'll make something like science impossible, really. I mean, or you'll have a different kind of science. So I think our whole Western worldview is built on this separation of the subject and object. And to the extent this stuff brings them back together and says, no, they're really the same, whatever that is, it makes this objectivity really very difficult and maybe impossible. So I understand why it's resisted, but I just think it's so, Jeremy. I mean, we can resist it all we want, but it is what it is. Reality is what it is, despite what we want it to be or say it is. And certainly that's what Nietzsche thought. And it's also what I think, that most of the things we believe and think about reality are simply illusions that work. Okay, they make us feel better and they allow us to get up in the morning and raise families and go to work and so on, but they're just not so. It's just not what the real really is. And that happens to matter to me personally. It matters to a lot of people. It does not matter to everyone, by the way. I think most people don't give I won't be vulgar, but they just don't care,
Well, they may not, but then, I mean, something hits you and you we've always got that hole, the thing that's missing. And then
but some people, it's sometimes, for many people, nothing ever hits them. They never have these experiences. And I think we have to honor that and understand that and just accept it. And people are different. And that's why, again, to go back to my idea of the superhumanities, I'm not arguing that everybody in the humanities has these extraordinary, occult experiences. That would be silly. Most of the humanities don't work like that. But some of the authors we still revere to this day, their works were based on these events. And I don't think we can understand the ideas without understanding the events that essentially gave these ideas to these individuals. That's what I'm saying. But
do you think in your readings did Nietzsche ever bounce any of this off of people who would be more receptive, maybe guru types or mystics?
He, I'm not a Nietzsche scholar, but what I know about his life is he suffered a lot. He left the academy at a very young age for a variety of reasons, including health reasons, and he spent most of his life just wandering around Europe, very, very ill, and then collapsed in Turin in January of 1889, probably of a brain tumor, by the way, growing behind his right eye. He'd grown blind in his right eye, by the way. So his symptoms suggest some kind of cancerous tumor growing in his brain. And then he lived for another 10 years, 11 years. I think he dies in 1900 or somewhere right around then. But he's entirely gone. He's psychologically gone. And his sister basically takes care of him as an invalid who's basically lost his mind. So, no, I don't think. And he knew about Asia. He knew about Buddhism. He writes about Buddhism fairly regularly and compares his thought to Buddhist thought. But he didn't know a lot about it, and it wasn't yet the time where Europeans were going certainly to India or China or Japan. They knew some things, but they didn't know a lot. But his thought. There are many, many receptions of Nietzsche, including some really, really nasty ones in Nazi Germany, but also some very socially activist democratic ones in the US. But the ones that in some ways are the most interesting to me are the Japanese and Buddhist ones. The sort of Zen Buddhist tradition sees Nietzsche as essentially enlightened, and they read his thought through Buddhist philosophy, which I think is quite accurate, actually. I mean, it's very convincing to me personally, but maybe that's because it's partly my earlier training. The stuff he says about beyond good and evil and a kind of rejection of morality as a social illusion, very, very familiar in Hindu non-dualism, for example. So I think there are resonances there, but he wouldn't have known them, Jeremy. I think he came to this spontaneously or naturally, as it were. And then he expressed it in the terms he had, which was as a European, a German intellectual and a classicist, someone who could read Greek like, it was German. I mean, he knew Greek. That's how he was trained. And so he talked a lot about Dionysius and later, Zarathustra, who was Zoroaster, the old, the first prophet, as it were, in ancient memory. So yeah, he didn't have a guru. He didn't, to my knowledge, didn't do any of that because it was too early. And Jeremy, let me add this. You don't need Nietzsche. I mean, I'm talking about Nietzsche because he's one author in the humanities we read, and we just skate over the superhuman nature of his thought. But he is the person that gives us this word Übermensch or Übermenschliche, superhuman, and that becomes the Superman in American English in 1905, by the way. And the guy in blue tights and the red cape, he doesn't show up till 1938. I mean, this is 33 years after, the American Übermensch. So there's a lot going on, in American culture that feeds into that sort of pop cultural image. And then the real avatar of Nietzsche today in pop culture is Magneto, by the way. It's not Superman. If you want to know what Nietzsche would have thought, just listen to Magneto in an X-Men film. It's pure Friedrich Nietzsche.
Well, I it's interesting because if I've read too much of anyone, it's Jiddu Krishnamurti, and people who know that about me have always asked me, what do you think of Nietzsche? And I'd read some, but not a whole lot, and my readings completely influenced by, what I've been told also is like, well, he seems to get it intellectually, but he didn't, there was no big life-changing epiphany there for him. He was one of those people who got it intellectually. But I think what you're showing me is that I'm wrong.
No, that's just wrong. I mean,
we've been hoodwinked.
Yeah, no, you've been hoodwinked. That is the reception of Nietzsche. That's the line you will get if you take a class in college on Nietzsche. But I think it's just fundamentally wrong. It's just wrong. He had this awakening in August of 1881, and everything is different after that. And you read his late books, and they're just these ecstatic, mystical texts that are just wild. I mean, oh my gosh, they're just wild. So no, I mean, I just think that's wrong. He does, you can see Krishnamurti, you can pick up resonances. Krishnamurti, of course, was very coming out of a Advaita kind of non-dual tradition in India, but sounds a bit like Nietzsche sometimes. I read a good share of Krishnamurti years ago.
Well, thank you again for learning us, at least me. I've definitely learned something. And I guess get ready for everyone's questions tomorrow on Sunday by the time people are hearing this. Jeff Kripal, thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for having me.
Oh, come on. You're seasoned pros by now. You know that there's a 10-minute break right here. So get up, check your messages. I don't know. Walk around. Pet the dog. Do you have a dog? You a cat person? I don't know. Just don't tickle anyone. We'll see you back here in 10 minutes with our final speaker of the day, Whitley Strieber. Psst. Hey, over here. While everyone's out making a ham sandwich or a tofurkey, whatever, I'm going to let you in on a secret. I feel like there's something missing from this conference. Something that I can provide that is a little bit more tangible, and you are seeing it now. You remember on Friday when I was talking to Lehuen Tiokasin about the possibility that interconnecting peoples from around the world may have built giant structures through sort of intuited or inherent knowledge just given to them by Earth, perhaps, or sort of out of the ether on how to build giant monolithic structures. And then we talked to Jeff Kripal similarly today about that in terms of certain philosophers or members of the humanities, such as Friedrich Nietzsche, who have rational, fully formed bunches of information that just sort of come to them, again, out of the ether, through what we would call mystical experiences or visionary encounters. And that's sort of touched on with Dennis McKenna in terms of through psychedelics in some sense. But really, what Dennis McKenna provides is the scientific point of view that if this stuff ain't provable, it ain't real. That means that science does not allow for the transrational, doesn't allow for the transpersonal. And so what you're seeing that guy do on your screen right now, that very, very fat man who looks like he ate another very, very fat man, and both of them are gluten intolerant, why that man, who is also me, is doing a bunch of these transpersonal moves right now. In other words, I'm not doing them. Yes, my body is doing them, but it is not my will. It's not a possession. It's not like a demonic thing or anything like that. But it is what is commonly called Kundalini. If you have ever heard of Kundalini, read a book about it, seen a YouTube video, throw it out. I have lived with this almost 2 decades. I know of what I speak. That stuff is garbage. There is no activating and deactivating Kundalini. Or if there is, it's the equivalent of turning over your car engine by turning the key and having it chug a few times and going, well, that's the same as driving to the store. Well, it's not. So if, in fact, any of these Kundalini masters or whatever that you see, or Kundalini awakened people are having these experiences and it is Kundalini, they're doing it wrong because they're involved. It is not something that you activate and deactivate it. It's something that when you shut up, when you step aside and allow it to exist, it just comes into being and it does whatever it's going to do. And even if I don't know, which I don't know what it's doing, the result is always, or has always been, healthful. It does awaken you in certain ways. It does make you healthier in certain ways. It's not helping with the weight, but apparently that's not an issue, right? Hey, Buddha was a great big fat guy. Come on. We can't all be Richard Gere. Is he relevant anymore? I don't know. In any event, I'm not just making fun of myself to make fun of myself. I want to make a point about this. But first, let's back up. Let's notice that when I walked up into the gazebo, I just set my will aside, and in the snap of a finger, this Kundalini comes alive and does its thing. So there's no pomp and circumstance. There's no particular setting that I need to be in. I don't need to have a man bun. I don't need to have six-pack abs. And here I am, prancing around, hopping foot to foot and all of that. Sometimes I will direct it to help heal people or pets, and it will work. It will work to an extent. Usually, sometimes it'll cure you of something completely, but more often than not, it will help. But because you or the animal are who you are, you're going to continue to keep hurting yourself. And so there's nothing I can do. But the point is, it's not there are healing properties that are involved. So in other words, there is something that my will can do to suggest or direct this, and then it can do certain things that look magical, like healing, but they're not 100%. They're not foolproof. I mean, you may have a better time with aspirin. Who knows? But I'm just throwing that out there. It has real world applications, this Kundalini. The information that is maneuvering through my body is doing something in the environment, and it's doing something for me and for other people, and yes, even for animals sometimes. So all of this is a fact, and yet the ironic thing about it is, or maybe paradoxical, it does no good to believe me. So in other words, if you're watching this and you believe what I'm telling you, that does you no good. Belief has no place here. Because it does no good to study this, in other words. It is for you to be, not even to experience, but for you to be. It's like having to, I hate to use computer analogies because then people think that you're being literal and that there's a matrix and we're all in it and we're all simulations or some nonsense. This is just an analogy, folks, but it is as if you have two processors in you. You've got or operating systems. You've got the Mac operating system and the Windows operating system in you. That's what this is. I'm Windows, and this is Mac. I don't know. It's Jer 2.0. I mean, it's not me at all, really. And yet it is me. It is and it isn't. So what that means is a broader discussion, unfortunately, for another time. I just want you to see what this looks like, what actual translogical, personal information coming through someone can look like. Now, this is different, obviously, than a philosopher having an aha moment or a visionary journey or, any of that. But it's another flavor of it, and it's something that is at least visual. And again, let's get back to that visual. So I am large. And so if it does you no good to believe me, it also does you no good to disbelieve me, because I am large and self-aware. And what that means is I know that this looks silly. I know that this is embarrassing. I know what it looks like when fat people dance around like this. I've lived it. I'm living it now. On top of that, as far as this conference goes, I am the host, and my wife and I are producers, and so we've put money into it, and we're not charging any money. So I'm not getting any money from this. My job as the host is secure. I don't need to show you this. There's no benefit for me to do this and fake it. I mean, if you're a skeptic or whatever, and you look at this and you go, he's lying or he's delusional, I hope you're getting the gist that I'm not delusional. I don't think as a delusional person I can rope into this conference the people that have done this for all of you and for me for free. So I'm putting my cred there on the line, but I'm also putting on the line that I can't be lying because I'm aware enough to know that that's not getting me anything. It's not earning me a buck. And any sort of fame I would get off this would be like, bullying morons and insulting people or something, or sycophants who want to believe in something. And that's never been my MO. That's not something that's, not only is it not important, it's a wrong move. So I really am just showing you how I've been living for almost 2 decades now. And there's a lot more to it, like I said, but I, it's beyond the scope of this conference, unfortunately. Just wanted you to see it. So I think it just adds another flavor to some of the things we've been talking about, but it also speaks to what I would say is the scientific arrogance that if it's not provable, that it ain't real. Well, then you're always going to be missing out. Because there is the transpersonal, there is the translogical. Transcends and includes the personal, transcends and includes the logical. There is a logical anchor here, or at least a rational anchor here. These movements do something in the world, and that's demonstrable. Is it provable? I don't care, because proof isn't the point. And that's the point. There are things in life that not only don't need to be proven, but don't fall within the realm of provability being a factor. They're not even in the same room. And yet they are real nonetheless. And more importantly, it's short-sighted to your own human nature and your own human wholeness to ignore the transpersonal and translogical. But don't tell any of the people who just came back from the pee break. This is our secret knowledge. Mystery Schools with Jeremy Vaney.
Jeremy Vaney, back with you, right? Come on, what other self-serious symposium is going to let their hair down? None of them. Well, thanks for showing up, everyone. I hope everyone's back from their potty break. Now we're going to go deep into a topic that is near and dear to me: high strangeness experiences, visitor phenomena, and the intelligence behind them, with a man who needs no introduction, but let's give him a little one anyway, Whitley Strieber.
As the author of such influential books as War Day, Nature's End, Communion, and Superstorm, and as the host of the popular Dreamland podcast, Whitley Strieber ranks among the cultural forces of our time. He risked his career and took on the scorn and ridicule that naturally go along with speaking the truth about something mysterious, something unknown, an intelligence he calls the visitors. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the Living Mystery Symposium, Whitley Strieber.
I'm Whitley Strieber, and I'm wondering what's going on here. I'm really wondering what's going on here. Back in 1985, I experienced the impossible. I woke up in the middle of the night because something seemed to be off. There was a noise around me. It was not right. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I saw was what appeared to be the face of a huge insect peering at me. My initial thought was it was a nightmare, and it crossed my mind that since I had been writing horror novels for some time at that point, although I had not written one in about 5 years, this could be a nightmare that could lead to the writing of a horror novel. I wasn't in my bed. I tried to make the bed kind of come up around me, tried to reimagine it. And that did not happen. The next thing I knew, I had an object inserted into my rectum, and that did not feel like any sort of imaginal experience, and in fact left a scar that I was under medical treatment for many years, and that continued to pain me off and on for 20 years. Unfortunately, it pained me not only physically, but I was so shy about it in my book Communion. I called it a rectal probe, which made me a laughing stock, and I had the unpleasant experience of being a laughing stock for having been raped. That's not something you would want to wish on anybody. However, I will say this, in the world we live in, it is no longer appropriate to make jokes about people for their ethnic origins, their religious beliefs, their abilities, anything about them that is different and that in the past might have made them figures of fun. And there was a time, after all, when people paid a shilling to go to Bedlam in London to amuse themselves watching the antics of the insane. I found myself laughed at for being raped. I became a poster boy for what were known as rectal probe jokes. And that was painful. It was part of my reality, and it still is. So that was one type of fallout from my experience. What happened to me afterwards were two things. First, I began to have to contend with physical injuries. My head was injured, and my rectum, as I say, was injured. And with memories that were not possible. They weren't possible, at least not in the universe I lived in at the time. I remembered these two different forms of being very clearly, apparently not from this world or of this world, or are they or were they? Well, we'll discuss that a little bit more. And I had an inkling that there was just something wrong. And I thought to myself, what if I've been attacked by someone using some kind of hallucinogenic drug and hypnosis? The reason I thought that as a possibility was that some years before, I had written a book called War Day with my friend Jim Konetka, and it had been created quite a stir. Ted Kennedy had read from it on the floor of the United States Senate, and it had led to the end of a plan that the administration had to harden American industrial sites against nuclear attack on the theory that limited nuclear war, in the phrase that they used in those days, was winnable and survivable. Yeah, it's true that probably the Ford plant and the General Electric plant could be made to survive, but what about your house? They didn't say much about that. So the book became a cause célèbre, and sometime after it had been published, one of Kennedy's staffers called me to talk about other things and said in passing, well, you might get political attacks because the administration was very disappointed about what happened. And I thought then that would mean what used to be known as a political tax audit. That's a tax audit where someone in high place in politics makes the IRS audit you to the nth degree in order to punish you for something political. That doesn't happen anymore, but in those days it was still fairly common. But now, after this, what had to have been a hallucination and some kind of attack, as far as I was concerned, I thought, what if they used LSD on me? And what if this caused these hallucinations? They used a combination of LSD and hypnosis, and then physically raped me and attacked me in order to try to drive me insane and make me a laughingstock so that I would be forever discredited in the political and literary worlds. So I began to pursue it as a crime. And what then happened was, I thought to myself, who do I know in the intelligence community who might know something about this? Well, I've known a lot of people in the intelligence community. Most people who went to college during the Cold War knew people who had been recruited by CIA, which was recruiting very heavily at colleges in those days. And it turned out I did know one fellow who had been recruited and had joined the CIA. So I thought, if he doesn't actually know about this, maybe he could give me some advice. But I thought he did know about it. Let me tell you why. At the beginning of the experience, I was sitting in this circle of people. All of them were wearing sort of bodysuits with these glasses on, the goggles on, big round goggles, and they were short and slight. One of them was familiar. It was my friend who had joined the CIA. He was not only there, he spoke to me extensively. He talked to me about the stealth aircraft, which in those days were a deep, dark secret, and explained how the exhaust manifolds that were being designed to minimize the amount of exhaust and heat that came out of the devices, of the planes, were going to cause them to catch fire. Now, I knew nothing about stealth aircraft, and knew then and know now next to nothing about aircraft design, except when I'm in one, I hope the theory of powered flight is correct, and it usually turns out to be. So I listened to all of this, and then the next thing I knew, I went up in the air like on an elevator with no elevator. Now, my thinking was that was the point where the LSD took over, and what my friend was saying, or former friend, I should say, was saying was actually a hypnotic suggestion that I was was being made to misunderstand as something else. That was the theory. So I decided, well, I've got his number, I'll call him. I phoned him. The number was disconnected, and I thought, aha, maybe it was him, in which case might get permission to sue the United States government, which I will certainly do. So I telephoned his brother. His brother said, Whitley, I'm sorry to tell you he's been dead since last March. This was December of 1985. He died the previous March. And that threw me. I didn't think his brother was going to lie. His brother was not an intelligence officer. He was a very straightforward guy, good man. But I got the death certificate. It got the information about the death anyway, and there was definitely a death certificate. And not only that, it turned out I had other mutual friends who were totally disconnected with this, who had known of his passing. He died of an abdominal hemorrhage. So here I am now. What am I to think? This man I had an elaborate conversation with was dead while we were talking to each other. Well, there begins the rest of my life. The rest of my life. I wrote the book Communion, and published it to the expectation that, a few people would be interested. And it was, of course, an explosive literary event that's become part of history. It was so big and has had such repercussions. It changed the whole culture, frankly, and much to my shock and confusion, to be honest with you. A year later, something else happened. I had already had numerous experiences with these entities because I started going out in the woods in the middle of the night to signal to them that I was ready for more. I was not ready for more. I was absolutely terrified, but at the same time, I was too curious because whatever this was, it was no ordinary experience. That had become quite clear. And so I published Communion in 1987 in October, and toward Christmas, a friend who lived on the same road that we do, is a retired state police officer in New York, came over and said, "Whitley, I've got something I'd like to talk to you about." He had read the book, and he said, "I saw this happen to you." We were coming home late that night from a Christmas party, he and his wife. They went past a certain field near our houses, snowy night, and they saw what looked to them like the Goodyear blimp hanging over the field. And having been in the state police, he thought it was his obligation to definitely stop and try to help whoever was in there, because that thing obviously did not belong in any field in upstate New York at that time of night, for sure, on a cold winter night. So he got out and climbed the fence. It's not much of a fence. It wasn't in those days. I haven't been up there in a long time, so I don't know what it's like now. In any case, he climbed the fence and walked up through the field toward the thing. And as he walked toward it, he heard someone screaming inside. And he began to run toward it. Whereupon it burst out with lights all over it and began moving quite quickly toward him, making a growling noise. His wife in the car freaked out, naturally, and he turned around and ran back and got in the car and drove off. And he said, "Whitley, I'm very ashamed because I think it was you, and I think I might have been able to help you." And I said to him, "Forget it. You're damn lucky you left. You couldn't have possibly helped me." Now, what I have just told you sounds like I discovered, after an initial period of confusion, that I had been abducted by aliens. So why didn't I just say that in communion? Why don't I just say that now? I've had much more experience with them over the past 30 years. They're part of my life. My life would be unlivable without them. They're closer to me than most of my friends will ever be. But what in the world are they? Well, let's take a journey rather than tell you endless stories about, oh, well, this person said that, and this person said that, and this and that. I want to go down another road. This is the road of question. Let me tell you why I want to go down that road. Ironically, it involves in part something I learned from a dead person, specifically my wife Anne, who is behind me, after she died. What she said was, the human species is too young to have beliefs. What we need are good questions. We wrote a book together after she died called The Afterlife Revolution. Now, why would I think that there was anything real in that? After all, when we're dead, we're apparently completely gone. And was not gone. And I'll tell you how I know that in a moment. The presence of a dead person, in my experience, turns out to be central to the whole what is known as close encounter experience. And I think this mystery is also very much focused on the mystery of the dead. I think the two things come together somehow. After my experience and the book, we began to get letters, hundreds, then thousands. Then it reached a point where the post office workers were bringing bags of mail and heaving them onto the floor of our apartment. In the dear dead days before email had dried up so much of our ability to communicate. And Anne began reading these letters. I read some of them, but there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, thousands. And she finally said, Whitley, I need a secretary. And so we hired a secretary. And one day she came out of her office and she said to me, Whitley, this has something to do with what we call death. And the reason why she was reading so many letters from people who had experienced contact with their dead friends and relatives while having contact with aliens. So this is another layer of ambiguity here. The dead are involved, my friend, other people have the same experience. So what is this? What does it have to do with us and the way the world works, really works? And why are we having so much difficulty with all of this material, this type of material? The dead also became a fixture of experiences at our cabin. We discovered fairly early on that if we brought friends up to the cabin, they might well have experiences too. In fact, that happened in the October before the communion experience. We had two friends, Annie Gottlieb and Jacques Sandelescu, who were a couple up there, and their stories are repeated in I believe, Transformation, the second book. They had, or they may even be in communion because we talked about it before then. They, one night during the weekend that they were there, the entire place suddenly lit up like daylight, more than daylight. It was so great that Jacques woke up and thought he had overslept because it was light outside. Annie was awakened not by the light, but by the sound of feet scurrying across the floor upstairs, which is where our bedroom was. Their guest room was downstairs. Then there was a huge bang. Our little 7-year-old cried out. I had already waked up because the light had waked me up and I thought the roof was on fire. So I had just leaped out of bed when there was this explosion took place and my son cried out and the light disappeared, meaning there was no fire. I ran downstairs. I was not aware of anything scurrying across the floor. Annie assumed it was our cats, but our cats were not there. They were in the city. So, and I could see Annie and Jacques had been awakened, and I said, don't worry about it. It's nothing. Why in the world I would say that, I don't to this day know. Then I went in and comforted my son. He went back to sleep, and I went back upstairs and went back to sleep. And the next morning we thought, what in the world had happened? Well, apparently it was one of these visits. That's all I can say. Now, so this had already happened, but later Annie began to invite people up to the cabin, and they had close encounter experiences, really remarkable ones. There was one night when there was a film crew in the living room. Lori Barnes, Anne's secretary, was in the bedroom, one bedroom. Raven Dana, a woman whose Anne had picked her letter out and said, we want her to come up to the cabin because I think the visitors might respond to her presence. was in the second bedroom. Anne was asleep upstairs. I was, because Andrew was having to camp out in the woods, I was out in the woods with him. There's no way I was going to let my boy camp out in those woods alone without me. And 2 other friends were in the woods as well. So that was the situation. We also had the film crew, Drew Cummings and his wife, had a low-light camera pointed down the hallway where all the downstairs bedrooms were, in hopes of catching something on video. Laurie Barnes was awakened by something moving in the room and opened her eyes and found what she thought was a raccoon coming in through the window, as if a raccoon would ever come into a house through a window. But the problem was it was screened. All the windows were screened and the screens were screwed closed. I had worked hard to harden that house against intrusions, as you may imagine. So it had come through the closed screen without tearing it. And it was a little creature with great big black eyes who communicated to her, "What can I do for you?" It reached out its hand to her, and she touched its hand and felt an electric sensation going through her that was not unpleasant. That's something I had also felt. On the wall, there was a symbol of the god Horus, the Eye of Horus. And when this was happening, the symbol was something to do with the experience, not to do, there wasn't a decorative feature of the cabin at all, but she could see it there. In other words, what you're seeing is something that is intimately related to core myth somehow. It does seem to be a very strange sort of experience. The creature had a particular odor which she described. I recognized it immediately. It was the smell of the forest floor, because we'd already discovered that there's not, as often as not, they didn't come down from above, but up from below. And it came through the forest floor, I suppose, and brought that scent with it. And it's a pretty ripe scent, the scent of if you go in a forest and dig down, you'll find that the layers of rotting leaves have a pretty sharp stench. In any case, the creature then, Laurie said, Raven said, when it asked what it could do, said you could walk down that hall, which was where the camera was. So it left the room and then appeared in the room with Laurie Barnes, and there was an exchange with her and another woman who was there, and it left. We looked through that video bit by bit, layer by layer, and didn't see a single thing in it, much to my anger and disappointment. But what is happening here? What are we seeing? Prior to this, to add a little depth here, Laurie had been walking out down the road in front of the house in the late afternoon, just taking a walk. And her brother had walked up to her and said, "Laurie, I just want to let you know I'm all right." And she said, "My God, where have you been?" He disappeared 30 years before and was declared dead by the FBI years before. She said, "Come down and meet my friends." Whereupon he smiled at her and backed away and kind of floated off into the woods and disappeared. When she came sort of staggering down to the house with that story, Anne said, "The visitors will be here tonight." As indeed happened, as I just described. So what is all of this about? The dead are involved? Don't we just die and disappear? Isn't life all we have? No, apparently not. As after she died, Annie had become an expert on the near-death experience. The reason being that she had a near-death experience in early 2005, when she had a burst aneurysm. She came out of that experience unafraid of death, completely unafraid of death, which would stand well because she later, in 2013, she got brain cancer. And in 2015, she passed on. In August of 2015, August the 11th at 7:15 in the evening, she died. Or sort of died. I was sitting in the living room, just sitting there, in a state of extraordinary grief. It had been more than a happy marriage. It was like a union of beings. It was a very, very close relationship. And the phone rang, and I thought, oh no. No one had been told about this except a couple of friends up in Malibu. They hadn't told anybody. I looked at it, and it was a friend of Anne's, Belle Fuller. And I thought to myself, I don't want to talk to Belle right now. I don't want to have to be the one to tell her. But I answered it. And the strangest thing happened. Belle said, Whitley, is Anne all right? She knew Anne was sick. All of our friends did. And I said, Belle, Anne died at 7:15 this evening. And Belle said, because Whitley, I just heard Anne's voice in my ear tell me as clear as a bell to call you. That's why I'm calling you. And I realized I had been asking Anne for a sign, and that happened. Similar things happened again and again over the next week, week and a half. One person after another would call and say Anne had told them to call them. They'd heard her voice. And I finally decided, okay, I'm skeptical, but not that skeptical. There is something going on here. And a relationship began between me and Anne. I went to a conference in Nashville, Tennessee, held by William and Claire Henry, both old friends. And the reason I went was that Claire, I had been sitting on a bench in the mountains east of Los Angeles near Palm Springs, and meditating about Anne and saying, Annie, I would like you to contact me somehow right now. And my cell phone rang. And this is not it was in cell phone service. That was not sort of a miracle at all. And I picked it up, and it was Claire Henry. And she said, Whitley, I just had an odd thing happen. I heard Anne say to me that she wanted me to call you right away. And so here I am. And I thought, thank you, Annie. And by that time, I was fairly sure this was happening. And I accepted it. And so I went to their conference because I wanted to see them, and I wanted to experience the lovely feeling of you get when you've shared something like that with somebody. And at the conference, a woman came up to me and said, Mr. Strieber, I have something I would like to tell you, but it's really strange, and I'm not sure you'll what you'll think. I said, you're worried that I'll think it's too strange? Me? Go ahead and tell me. That's not going to be a problem. So she said, I just heard your wife's voice say clearly, tell Whitley I can see him when he's in the chair. Now you notice where we are. We're not talking about aliens anymore. We're talking about something even less probable in some ways, which is continued life after death. Not only life after death, but coherent life after death. So I understood instantly what she meant. Instantly. Back in 1970, or I guess it was the fall of 1969, Anne and I joined a group called the Gurdjieff Foundation. Now, I have not just sneezed. G.I. Gurdjieff was an Armenian philosopher and spiritual searcher, and a very good one. He knew of whereof he spoke. He came out of the Middle East to St. Petersburg, Russia before the revolution. And then after the revolution, went first to Berlin and then Paris, where he founded an institution known as the Institution for the Harmonious Development of Man, which is now known worldwide as the Gurdjieff Foundation. We were not really spiritual searchers, but we had a friend. I was working on a movie called The Owl and the Pussycat, and one of the other production assistants was a real serious spiritual searcher, and he said that he wanted us to read P.D. Uspensky's book about Gurdjieff, In Search of the Miraculous, and so we did. And we were pretty taken by it. It was a fascinating, if rather arid, sort of system of awakening, saying that the average life is actually lived in a state of sleep, and that there's more to being human than the way we are in an everyday basis. One of the exercises in the foundation is known as the sensing exercise, where you take your attention. It turns out we can move our attention a lot. We can do a lot with it. I think we're probably the only animal that can do this, but you can take your attention, you can move it onto your body and split it between your thoughts and your body. And if you do that enough, over time, you end up with a larger attention, because your attention to your body develops into something more like an attention to another whole level of your being. And so we started doing the sensing exercise in 1969, and I've been doing it ever since. I do it every day. I do it at 11 at night, now also at 3 in the morning, which I'll get into in a minute, and at 1 in the afternoon with a few friends, which we use Zoom. Anyone is welcome to join. Just send me a letter at whitley@strieber.com, by the way, if you wish to. So we had been doing the sensing exercise, and the minute Anne said that, sit in the chair, I can see you, I knew, because that was where I did the sensing exercise every night at 11, every night, and had been for nearly 50 years at that point. So when I went home, I immediately started doing the sensing exercise more intensely than ever. And then suddenly at 3 o'clock one morning, something electrocuted one of my toes. I leaped out of bed thinking that there was a loose wire, but there was no loose wire. There was just me. And so naturally I grabbed my phone and I'm looking up gout on Google in the middle of the night. And by the way, if you're interested in the Gurdjieff Foundation, just as an aside, just Google Gurdjieff, Gurdjieff Foundation, and you'll find it. They will, if they are interested in, you can engage with the foundation that way. So in any case, I was sitting there and standing there, and I Googled, wasn't gout. So what had happened? Well, I went back to bed. What else could I do? The next night, a fingers grabbed my right nipple and shook the dickens out of it. I flew out of that bed because that had been fingers. That was no dream. And there was nobody there, of course. But then I remembered something. Back in the 90s, I had in our cabin a meditation room which was up under the roof. It was at a cathedral ceiling. And I was doing the exercise in that room every night when suddenly one night 7 thuds came down onto the roof. And the next thing I could feel people in the room but couldn't see them. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried to meditate with a room full of invisible people, but in my life, it ain't going to happen. I am no guru. So I sat there for a few minutes and I could feel their presence very clearly. And at that time, we had a lot of invisible presences in the house. The interesting thing that when the cats were at the cabin, they could always see them. And you could see the cats reacting to them. In any case, the cats weren't there, but I finally said, look, I know there are people in here and I can't meditate with invisible people. You're going to have to show me what you look like. And no one showed up. So I said, okay, good night. I'm going to bed. And I went to bed. 3 o'clock in the morning, bang, bang, bang on my left shoulder, someone wakes me up. A familiar event. I open my eyes and I see sitting down on the foot of the bed a man. He's a human being. There's, of course, a moment of fear. But then I see he's in a kind of a tunic, and he's not looking like someone you would see on the street. Not enough. And I thought to myself immediately, my God, they're showing me what they look like. So I got out from under the covers and crawled down to the foot of the bed, and I'm this far away from him at this point, just looking right at him. And he's looking back at me. His eyes are dark and deep but human. It's a human face. And his arms are down beside him on the bed. He's very still. And I think, I'm going to smell him. I'm going to smell his skin and see if this is real, because I need another sense to come in here. So I pick up his hand. I smell the back of his hand. And the guy not only is real, he's ripe. This is someone from some other level of reality where the bath has not yet happened. He smells so ripe that it's shocking to him too, because I drop his hand and he then sort of jerks and disappears, as if he's kind of been walking a tightrope to enable me to see him. And then he's gone. Well, then I go back in the room and I meditate at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I meditated at 3 o'clock in the morning until that October when we lost the cabin. In the outside world, the rectal probe jokes were running thick and fast. South Park had published had shown its pilot, which was a huge hit, especially among young people. And it was a lampoon of me. And the creators of South Park even said in an interview at one point that they had been very careful and used lawyers so that I would not be able to sue them. This is a world in which people are punished for anything unusual, and lately just punished. You used to just punish them to death. You used to burn them to death, chop their heads off, starve them to death, anything. But now heretics like me are just frowned upon and shunned and pushed outside of the context of the society. Okay, so that was happening outside, and we lost the cabin. On the last night, they came banging down onto the roof as usual. See the thing that's so weird? Banging down onto the roof like they weighed a lot, and then coming through it and being invisible, being so ephemeral while visible that they almost, he was not much heavier than smoke. And yet it's just such a strange experience. You see how it's not working on so many different levels, and yet there is a concrete element here that is almost undeniable. It's extraordinary. Okay, now, some of you, I'm sure, are trying to put this into various belief systems and fit it into what you already believe. Take my wife's advice to heart. The human species is too young to have beliefs. What we need are good questions. Take it to heart. Live it. Don't try to explain what I am telling you in any way at all. Just be confident of one thing. I am trying my best to describe real experiences, most of which lie outside the context of our expectations. I am not dissembling. I am certainly not lying. And I am attempting to be as accurate as possible am I being accurate in the sense of, am I telling you precisely what actually happened? No, I am telling you my memories of what I recall seeing. That's what I'm telling you. So, when at this point I had been meditating with them at 3 o'clock every morning when we lost the cabin. On the last night, I was sitting in the meditation room, and I'm saying in my mind, this is the last. You will never see me here again. You will never see me in this room again. And there's a sort of uneasy shuffling on the roof above. And then we leave. We go down to Texas, where we had a little condo, thank God, or we would have been homeless. And we began living in a little condo. The loss of the cabin was the saddest thing in my life. The loss of access to Manhattan was Anne's tragedy because she loved living in Manhattan. But our lives were getting smaller. The world was working on us, beating us down, beating us down. So one of the things that had happened in the months prior to our departure was that what looked to me like an 11-year-old boy at first, I had found him out in the woods, smoking, sitting near a type of tree called a pitch pine, sitting under a tree. And it was August when I found him, and it was very, very hot. And pitch pines just explode. I mean, they're like bombs if you touch a match to them. So since he looked like a little boy out there smoking on the sly, I walked over to him to recommend that he step away from the proximity of the pitch pines. As I walked up to him, he looked at me and made a low growling noise that suggested to me that perhaps I would be wise to turn around and get out of there real fast, which I did. He was an ordinary little boy. We began to find areas in the woods, way out in the woods, where there were piles and piles of cigarette butts. He was like a schizophrenic who uses nicotine to quiet his voices. He smoked all the time. And one evening, actually, Annie and I went skinny dipping in the pool because it was a very lovely pool and it was very hidden. We skinny dipped in it all the time. Immediately beyond the deck where the pool was, there was thick foliage you could not see through. But underneath that foliage, it was open because it was woods. And under the foliage, there was places that were you could walk through them. And as we're skinny dipping, we can hear him running up and down in that area, breaking limbs, twigs, and making a ruckus and going, oh, oh, like he's crying out, but has no ability to speak. We went inside. It was not a good skinny dipping moment, to say the least. So then we left the cabin, left it behind. About a week after we moved into the little condo, which was on a ground floor facing the street, it had a little screen porch and a little cul-de-sac beside the porch, I began to smell cigarette smoke. And we had smelled it often in the house when the air was still and he was out there smoking constantly. You would smell it in the house. It was extremely annoying. And I was annoyed in the condo too. I thought, oh my God, I'm in an old condo now. There's going to be people smoking all over the place. But then I realized there was somebody there in the cul-de-sac. I went out on the porch and they darted around the corner immediately. Then I began to feel somebody kind of insinuating themselves into my mind, and in a funny kind of way that it was as if there was somebody kind of exploring me. And it was like being more naked than we are normally. It was very odd. Then I realized it was him. I went out a couple more nights and he would run around the corner. And obviously it was him, because then we saw in the cul-de-sac on the ground all these cigarette butts. So it was him. He'd come down to Texas. He'd followed us somehow. Reflect on how strange this actually is. Because I'm not talking about ghosts or elusive aliens. I'm talking about someone who was physically real. So I put a motion-sensitive light up in the cul-de-sac. I found out that he was living with two men in the condo immediately next to ours, just a few feet away from it. And I'll tell you about those two men in a minute. In any case, a few days passed, and before I put in the motion-sensitive lights, people in the condo saw him. They saw him. Someone saw him climbing a wall, and he got up onto a second-floor deck and pulled the spokes out of someone's bicycle tires, and he caused enough trouble around the condo complex to where people were calling social services to try to, because they thought he was a feral child or a child who was not being properly supervised, which he certainly wasn't being supervised by anybody as far as I know. In any case, we figured out, Anne and I did, that he was living in this apartment with these two men, and they were very odd. I have to tell you, if there's such a thing as a demon, that's what these guys were. So I called the owner of that apartment, and he said, "Mr. Strieber, it's empty. There's nobody living there." And so I said, "Well, there are people. You've got squatters then." He then came up and determined that this was the case, and called the sheriff and had them evicted. And after the eviction notice went up, they came around, the two men, not the little boy, came around knocking on everybody's door, trying to sell the guy's furniture to us, as if we didn't know they were squatters. Imagine that. So they left, and one morning he comes back. I'm out working in a little garden of the condo, our little garden. The boy comes barreling around the corner and goes marching off down the street. And I never saw him again, and I never saw the two men again. What am I talking about? Isn't it fun? I just loved it. When I used to try to explain these things, I was not a free man. Now that I live with the questions, the taste of them, the feel of them in my mind and in my soul, I'm a free man. I don't have to decide a darn thing about any of this stuff. I will tell you this. I'm not allowed on many big TV or radio shows because I'm too weird. But I'm talking about a way of experiencing life that is simply very unfamiliar, but it is there. How was the boy real? What was he? Goodness knows. Well, I'll tell you one thing he could have been. If that experience in 1985 was an entirely physical experience, and it certainly seemed to be to me, they extracted semen from me. The rectal probe was a device that is still used to this day in animal husbandry. They'll stick it up in the ass of a bull to make him get a hard on and have an ejaculation so that they can use it to inseminate cows. But in those days, that same type of thing was used in human beings because there was no Viagra or anything. And that was what was used. And it stimulated the nerve and caused me to have an erection and an ejaculation. And they took the ejaculate. Does that mean that that boy was my son in some way? Because it was about 11 years later that he showed up in the woods. That's a haunting, haunting question, believe me. Believe me. Now, let's go on. Look at this from a different viewpoint. Try to roll up the rug on all of the, I reject this, I accept that, I don't believe this, I do believe that, that fits my belief system, that fits doesn't, and so that's got to be wrong. This has to, that one's sort of ambiguous. You got to figure out, what did he just say there? Forget all that stuff. Wipe it away. Erase the board. Let's look at this universe in a different way. You know, one of the most peculiar things about it is that it's not quite what it seems, or is that the understatement of the year? This universe is in a state of superposition. It is indeterminate unless observed. There have been endless experiments that have shown that to be the case again and again and again. Now, we don't know what level of observation is necessary to form it into what we see. We also don't know what information is present that causes it to form into one form and not another. So we're kind of at sea there. I think that life is ubiquitous in the universe, and that it is a kind of a film that is everywhere, not necessarily in complex forms, but in some form, and that its presence is what causes the universe to remain in a positional state. But if there is no observer, there is also nothing definite about the universe. It is in superposition, this we know. Remember when Annie said the human species is too young to have beliefs, but we need are good questions? She was actually speaking about a very high level of living. You know the phrase, as above, so below, that comes to us out of the mists of the past, that the below is here to reflect what is above. What is above is a question. It is a universe in superposition. So how do you reflect that? You reflect it by living in question. As above, so below. Living in question will set you free. Believe me. And I purposely made it real hard to do that today, because some of you are going to think, he has to be a spectacular bullshit artist. God damn it. This flies in the face of everything I believe. Yeah, I have been there and done that too. I have had that experience of my own experiences. I have rejected my own experiences because they were impossible for me to believe. They didn't fit into my belief system. Well, now I have no belief system. The hell with it. I threw it out. I have questions. Wonderful, lovely questions. Now, I can prove to you very quickly that you cannot live in any other state except a state of question. What I'm hoping is you'll recognize this. Here's how I'm going to prove it. There was a philosopher named Edmund Gettier. Back in the early 60s, there was a lot of movement in modern philosophy to say that we actually could determine a well-formed truth. We could determine truth. And that did not sit well with Dr. Gettier. And he came up with something known as the Gettier paradox, which I will restate now in one of its more straightforward ideations, known as the cow problem. A farmer has a cow. He has a Holstein, black and white Holstein. that he's worried about. She seems a little bit off. So he separates her from the herd and puts her in a field by herself. The field is near his barn where he's working, so he can look in the field and see how she's doing from time to time during his workday. He has in the field, it's a flat field, there are two features in the field. One is a tree, and one is a little hollow, which is behind the tree. If the cow were to wander into the little hollow, he wouldn't be able to see her for a short time. It's not a big hollow, which is why he's not worried about it. So he's working, a breeze blows up and happens to blow a piece of big piece of black and white paper into the field, which gets caught under the tree. In the meantime, the cow wanders into the hollow. She's perfectly fine. He glances into the field, sees the paper under the tree, and concludes that the cow is fine. This is an expression of the fundamental condition of the human mind. It is what we are and where we are, all summed up in this phrase. He is right. The cow is fine. He is wrong. He does not see her. He is right and wrong about the same thing at the same time. When you look out of your eyes into the world around you, this is the only real conclusion that you can draw about where you are. And if you want to wander into my neck of the woods, have fun. There's all kinds of things in here that I have not talked about today simply because I have an hour, not 10 hours. I live in the world in another way. One of the visitors called me at the beginning of my experience. You said, "You're the luckiest of the lucky." And I thought for years, what in the world could that mean? I'm as far from that as I could possibly be. But right now, living the life I am living, with my wife still living with me, wearing the two rings to symbolize the fact that there are two of us now and we share one body because the other body gave out. And not knowing anything about the level of final absolute reality that's there because there isn't one. Wandering in this great ocean of stars and questions. Oh, sure, she was right. That mysterious being who may or may not have existed. I think I am probably one of the luckiest people in the world. Thank you for spending some time with me today.
And there we have it, folks. That will wrap up Saturday's program. I'd like to thank our speakers, Dennis McKenna, Jeff Kripal, Whitley Strieber, and yesterday's speakers as well, Lahua Lopez and Teoxin Ghost Horse. Many mahalos to you all. Many thanks. Thank you all for joining us. And it's not too late to tell a friend about tomorrow. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be a 90-minute roundtable discussion with everyone you've just heard from, and we're taking your questions. We'll be speaking with each other. We'll be talking amongst ourselves about what we've learned from each other, and we'll be hearing from you as well. So please join us tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, 1 p.m. Pacific. Wherever you're watching this, it'll be a completely new live feed, but it will be there wherever you're watching this. So Facebook, Twitch, JLN Productions, YouTube, wherever. We will see you tomorrow. Take care. Thank you everyone again for tuning in to today's program. Please join us tomorrow for the roundtable chat wherever you are watching this at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, 1 p.m. Pacific Time. And if you want to give back, today's speakers have some recommendations for places you can donate money to. Dennis McKenna recommends the McKenna Academy. Jeff Kripal recommends the Esalen Institute. And Whitley Strieber recommends Mercy Corps. All of those websites you should see on your screen right now, and the full descriptions of where your money's going to and why, you can find at jalonproductions.com. Just go to jalonproductions.com and look at the little section there on the right called Giving Back. Click on that and you'll be brought into all of the speakers' charitable organizations and nonprofit organizations, including Tiokasin Ghost Horse and Lua Lopez's charities of choice. So please do consider donating in the name of any of the speakers you've heard here today or yesterday. And when I say donate in the name of, you don't have to put their names or anything. I'm just saying if a particular charitable organization of theirs jumps out at you, go ahead and give to it. All right, that's it. Thanks to my partner in crime and lovely wife, Carol Fong. Thanks again, Joe Gooch, for the music. Thanks to the speakers for making this possible, and you all for giving your time, your ears, and a little space in your mind to hear about diversity and consciousness.